Welcome back to Myth Vision. Noah's flood story was stolen from Mesopotamia. Now, before we even go further into this discussion, the title would make you go, huh? Stolen? There was no such thing as copyright back then. Duh. Well, of course, that's the academic position, right? Like we all know ancient stories were told and retold. There was no copyright or I'm going to sue you if you copy my story, even though there are examples when you get later in history, especially when you get like Quintilian and others who write around the turn of the first century, who complain about works that seem like they're not artistic enough. They would teach people how to model stuff based on other myths, other stories, and they would want you to be creative enough in changing that story, yet the inquisitive reader is aware of where that story is likely coming from, or at least is aware of the tropes in which the story is told. So they know about the themes, the elements, the tropes. And so it's about being artistic. And so, yeah, you could get in trouble for Xerox copying in the ancient world under certain context. So I want to just address the title. Is it stolen? No. But the reason I titled it Stolen is because there is a framing that happens within Christianity, specifically, and probably forms of Judaism. I don't think Muslims defend the Bible too often on that regard. In fact, they're always engaging and debating with Christians. That is, that Genesis happened in some way, or it's unique, and there is no copying, there is no borrowing. They downplay the significance of the Mesopotamian background to the point where they actually want you to kind of go, it probably didn't borrow at all. Okay. So I'm adding salt to the wound here, and I'm saying, yeah, it borrowed, and it looks like it may have been aware of many different sources. Some scholars argue that it looks like there may be a lost source that's an in-betweenie. It may not be Gilgamesh specifically. It may not be Enuma Elish specifically with Genesis 1. It may not be the Atrahasis Epic specifically when it comes to the Noah's flood, but there's some tradition of material that they were aware of. And most of the scholars I read who are PhD, and I think this is consensus, think that the narratives we're reading in Genesis 1 through 11 are during exile or post-exile under Babylonia or beyond into the Persian period all the way down into the Hellenistic, where they are writing and crafting these stories with knowledge of the Babylonian epics and all these tales. Now, we're going to take some time today and we're going to actually listen to a little bit of this guy, Wes Huff. Now, I know this is an older video, 2022, before he got his rise and shine to fame. But, if you just look at his, title, of course, is Noah plagiarized from Gilgamesh, right? Hyper-specific title here. And no, it's not plagiarized. But the way he formulates the entire video, it's as if it doesn't use or has no knowledge of Gilgamesh. And it's not actually crafting its story inspired by something from Gilgamesh. And I find that tricky. I find that to be quite slippery. I want to lay my cards up front. So we're going to cover some of that. We're going to play a clip here by this awesome guy, Irving Finkel, I believe is obviously an expert on ancient Assyrian, Babylonian, Sumeriology, if you will. This guy knows his stuff, and he has something interesting to say about people dying and, people who are killed by the flood of the gods in the ancient world. And we're going to get into some of that material here real quick. I just want to see who's in the chat. Kyle, what's up? Dan, thank you for making the critique. Of course, stolen. But you can see why this is a sensitive sore spot. Noah's flood wasn't stolen. It was a parody because the Bible is satire. Critics love this channel. Thank you. Gabriel, hi, Derek. Good to see everyone. Anne Marie, good to see you. non-believer in the house. Good to see you. Metalhead and T Rose. Good to see you. Love Irving Finkel. Yeah, we're gonna play a clip of that. I also have a friend of mine, Paul, the Inquisitive Bible reader, who has a video on this. We may actually get to watch some of that. Just to show you some of my sources that I have up. I have Gilgamesh up. Hold on, my computer's talking to me here, and it's trying to. There, I closed it. Okay. I've got Gilgamesh pulled up, and we'll zoom in and crop in closer because I want you to see some stuff for yourself, just to get a close up. Okay. Got some material here we could go over specifically, just showing you the order of some stuff. Books, of course, Irving Finkel's book. More material that we can go to. Enuma Elish, Genesis 1, if we have the time. I created this because you need to see this. This is the Ark tablet that Irving Finkel translated, and we're gonna take a zoom in on this. Also, we're gonna look at some books from David Carr, and I, of course, want to shamelessly plug all of these academics. We're going to take a look at another scholar. I would probably butcher the name, but I'll just say Helga. Kvangbig. I probably totally butchered it. Probably doesn't even, the K probably isn't even pronounced Vanvig. I'm not sure how they pronounce it. The book is on Amazon as well. We'll get to these. Eridu Genesis. We got to read some of that stuff, right? This is some of the PowerPoints that Dr. Joshua Bowen used when he was on a live stream with me, him, and Kip Davis, dealing with the issue of Genesis 1 and Enuma Elish parallels, and why the author of Genesis 1 likely knew and utilized, but also subverted the Enuma Elish. And then we also have another book here. I can't remember which scholar this is specifically. Oh, it's Catherine L. McDowell, and that was recommended to me by Dan McClellan today, actually, to take a look, just to give me an idea of how Genesis, image of God stuff is actually related to ancient Mesopotamia material. And then you got the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Joshua Bowen, which I figure we would read some of this because Josh actually takes and writes for a popular audience, but collects a lot of the consensus critical scholars on these points. Shameless plug for him and his book. And then his course, of course. I pinned that in the top. If you want to take Dr. Joshua Bowen's course, you could sign up today and take the whole course at your own pace, own it for life, the whole nine. Okay. Now, I love this topic. Okay. And so Stacy says, my favorite topic too. Yes. I love this topic. There's so much material. I mean, look, even with the material I brought, and I bring this up to scholars all the time, Adam, Eve, and the Devil, A New Beginning. There are so many interesting ways to approach this material, to consider potential antecedents or common tropes that just may be in the air, whether they're genetic, general, or, something that, they have heard or have an in-between text that we've lost in history, because that's a lot. There's a lot of that. I just find fascination with seeing those ancient texts. Genesis, the creation of mankind, the Garden of Eden with the serpent and all of that, getting to the flood narratives, and then these giants show up. What? Giant who? You get a Tower of Babel. You get all sorts of crazy, interesting storytelling. And I think that's why when I was a fundamentalist teenager in high school reading my Bible, I fell in love because I started where the book begins, and Genesis, not like a lot of Christians do in Matthew and read the Gospels. I read in Genesis, and I started reading my King James Bible, just running through this book. And I realized real quick, I'm there, and I absorbed the stories really easily. Once I got to the Gospels, they weren't as fun to me. Okay, I'm just keeping it real with you. They just were not as fun. And so we're going to have some fun. That's what I like to do. We already got a super chat in the house. Anti-Contrarian, thanks so much for the super chat. Could the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu traveling to the Cedar Forest to slaughter Humbaba be an early Semitic Akkadian polemic or territory claim against the Canaanites that we later see in the Old Testament? That's interesting. From what I understand, the Cedar Forest is in the north, though. So I imagine it's bordering on territory, but I don't think it's in Canaan. And I'm not sure about the geography for sure on that, but I don't think it's necessarily in Canaan. And I wouldn't make a leap without explicit evidence. And first of all, I'm not an expert, so I need to say that up front. But I would be interested to hear an expert think that this is actually Humbaba represents a people. We do have a lot of mythologists, if you will, not just Bible scholars, right? But like people who study mythology and common parallels in mythology, who recognize that oftentimes giants or people who are disfigured or other than, like the Cyclops in Homer, may represent people, like a group of people based on that author's standards that are foreign. But I don't know if Humbaba would represent, or Huwawa, depending on the source you're looking at, some people who were other than, and it may be, I don't know if it would be the Canaanites, but it could be. Mind you now, Gilgamesh, it's like a collection of a tradition that develops over time. Even the flood story where we read in Tablet 11 isn't till much later. So like the experts, and I just clarified this with Joshua Bowen earlier, who's an Assyriologist, that the flood traditions come after sometime after 2000 BCE. And but we have earlier Gilgamesh ideas and stories that are floating earlier. So it's like a growing tradition. And I don't know what to do with Humbaba in that regard and how to interpret that particular passage. It's interesting. I like this kind of thinking, even though it's we're not saying that's what it is, right? I like this kind of open-minded thinking in a way, because even when I read about the Exodus of Moses, before the Exodus happens and Moses goes off into the wilderness for 40 days, traversing this very harsh wilderness experience, crossing an unforgiving terrain that, usually you wouldn't make as a human. He passes through. It's like a heroic journey that I think mirrors Gilgamesh in some ways. And I think there are scholars who see even Moses reflecting some of that Gilgamesh epic in many ways. I love that kind of stuff. There may not be a definitive way of proving that kind of material, whereas I think the case that can be made by academics about Genesis 1 through 11, borrowing from these stories we have from Gilgamesh, Enuma Elish, Atrahasis Epic. I don't think they necessarily had Eridu Genesis, but it's all in the family of this tradition that goes back. They're clearly being inspired, and there's real linguistic evidence for that stuff. Joshua Bowen gets into that in his book, where he talks about the pitch, or the you're dealing with the pitch in the arc, and that is a hapax legomenon in Hebrew that does show up in all of the earlier stories, or at least the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh epic, when Utnapishtim's retelling the story of the flood, about how he got immortality to Gilgamesh. At the very moment in both of those earlier stories that shows up in Genesis, that specific term gets used. And then you got the 3 birds being let off. Man, wait till we hear the gibberish come out of Wes Huff's mouth about some of this. I mean, it just sounds like an excuse. And the fact that 6.1 thousand people liked the video that he did on this, it's like, yeah, whoo, you saved my Bible. And that's why I did a very triggering title, Noah's Flood Was Stolen. I did this on purpose. But it's like, dude, this is like, it's the same thing like when he debated, what's his name? Billy Carson, okay? Billy takes it so far, he practically would probably fit this plagiarism model in his debate with him. And then he takes the other way of trying to shield the Bible away from, as if it did not borrow. And it's like, you don't have to have the either or. You can realize there are creative authors who have differences intentionally. The differences do not divorce the source material as if it's not something that it actually borrowed from. It shows divergence from, which may be a theological difference. It's not dependent upon. I think that's unfortunate. So, and we'll address some of the things that Wes brings up in this video as we go. That I think, I'm just like, it sounds like a cope thing. So thank you so much, Anti-Contrarian. I don't know the answer to this question, but I figure I'd spend some time on it for you super chatting, and I really appreciate it. It helps support the channel. It's interesting. What if Humbaba represents the people of that region, or Phoenicians, or I don't know, something like that, because they're closely related. Victor Engelman in the house. I'm wearing an inky t-shirt right now. I think the Council of the Gods must have, conspired here to make this all happen. What do you say? Really, really appreciate you, man. Thanks for the super chat. Cedar Forest is Lebanon, though. That's true, in the north. So, yeah, I don't know. Appreciate everybody already. If you want to interrupt, feel free to do so with super chats, and I'll see them. They pop in my face. But I figure we do a little review here and listen to Wes Huff. I am sorry if you have a hard time stomaching some of the things he may say from time to time, but I'm going to make sure it's sped up a little so you don't have to spend too much time. I want you to hear what a well-known apologist who's taken as an authority among so many people, and they just believe what he has to say on this issue. And more people are going to buy up what he has to say because he's on all the big channels now, right? That a lot of people are like wanting to verify and validate their already pre-existing beliefs. So let's hear what Wes has to say. Uh-huh. Right. And I hope this is kind of, the music sounds funny because I have it sped up. Is this too fast? Oh, no sound. Mute is perfect. Someone said, I just spent 30 seconds with you guys watching that. All right, let me fix that. I hope it doesn't hurt me because he's got a little music in the background, but we're going to find out. Here we go. Starting it back. I really want to speed it up to 2 times speed just because, but here we go.
Many scholars, researchers, skeptics, and laypeople have pointed out that there are stories in the biblical Old Testament, like that of Noah's flood, that are very similar to other ancient Near Eastern stories of similar
Yes,
content.
there are.
Some have even gone as far to say that these types of biblical stories were influenced, inspired by, or even outright plagiarized from documents like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, there are obvious parallels between some of these other ancient stories and the narratives we find in the biblical accounts. Just as a very quick example, both the biblical flood story in Genesis 6 and the Epic of Gilgamesh have a character making a giant boat to weather a great flood. Both have birds being released. Both have a sacrifice being made immediately after the catastrophe.
Yeah.
And both have the favor and blessings of the god or gods in question. It's because of these types of similarities that some have accused a direct borrowing from the Mesopotamian story of Gilgamesh by the author of Genesis. The problem with these types of parallel claims is that they only truly exist on the surface. When further investigation...
Notice already the problem with these parallel claims is surface. And he spends the rest of this video just trying to give difference, trying to have you focus on the differences. And the differences are what make the difference, right? He points out. And I just think to myself, my goodness. Don't even listen to what experts have to say on this issue. I mean, yes, there's differences. Every scholar in the world knows that. And none of them immediately try to backpedal as if that's just surface level, as if they're not actually dependent or inspired or influenced in some way, shape, or form by the Mesopotamian myths that came before. The scholars don't play that game, but Wes is. Now, why would Wes want to play that game for his sacred, holy book that he needs to be true? Your guess is obviously as good as mine, and I think we're all going to agree on the same thing. He keeps going. Let's see what he has to say. But I mean, this sounds like already, let's backpedal. Let's back up a little bit. This is getting too hot.
Investigation is done, and especially when surveying what scholars of the ancient Near East actually say concerning the accusation, you'll see that outright plagiarism is actually very unlikely. Just to back up, this idea of ancient
outright plagiarism. It's unfortunate that the word plagiarism has to be used in this context, right? At least in the opening. If you're just now tuning in, I have already explained why I put Noah's flood was stolen, using very vivid language of taken. There was no plagiarism in the ancient world, but I think he just means copied or borrowed from. I think that's what he actually means. Though when he's arguing with someone else who says word for word or whatever, he can get away with word for word. No one else is allowed to say word for word and not mean word for word. But when he actually is, engaging with people who might be trying to think it's like borrowing directly, like copying every word or something, which isn't the case. You just go read the story side by side. None of them are copying each other word for word in that regard. There may be an occasional time where a later tradition in Mesopotamian stories actually keep a fossil, like they'll keep the name of one of the earlier gods for the same new character, or a character's name still exists within it, which kind of tells you the sources that they're using, right? Genesis doesn't do it that explicit, but I think as the linguistic, the pitch point that Joshua Bowen highlights, other scholars have recognized in Noah's flood account, that shows up exactly in the same spot in the story in Genesis as it does in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. You know, these are clues that make you obviously say, hey, this is a common tradition. They're borrowing. So when he says plagiarism, I think he means like borrowing. And he'll just spend the rest of this time showing differences.
Stems from a theory that what eventually became ancient Israelite culture was largely a product of influence from Babylonian society. In the late 6th century BC, the Israelites had been conquered by Babylon, and as you can read in places like the book of Jeremiah, certain Israelite individuals were carted off to Babylon, where they remained for 70 years. This event is well documented both within the biblical Old Testament as well as the archaeological record. A number of key Babylonian, Persian, Judean, and other ancient Near Eastern tablets have been discovered that describe the events during this time, and the presence of the Jewish exiles has been well documented within the historical record. It's this fact that individuals in the past have latched onto as the very—
In the past. I mean, you got to understand the way he kind of phrases is like, this is an outdated model or something. He's selling this to people, right, that are buying it. This isn't in the past. This is contemporary 2026 and will be contemporary in 2030 and 2040 and 2050. This isn't going to change. This is exactly what the scholars are seeing. I just don't, when you phrase words like that, and I'm being very peculiar because I know what he's doing and I've already seen the video before I did this live stream. He is literally trying to sell you that that's not what's happening. There's no borrowing seeming to happen here. He uses the word plagiarism or plagiarize, but no, clearly inspired by and borrowed from. And this isn't just people from the past. Clearly people from the past saw this. We're talking about right now consensus. And he's going to say it's not consensus, but that's just outright wrong.
Period when they say religious narratives, myths, legends, and folklore from the Babylonians started to permeate and weave their way into what eventually became the biblical book of Genesis. Many alleged parallels were put forward between ancient Mesopotamian stories and their biblical counterparts in an effort to prove that what most of the Bible says was derived from the Babylonian legends. Problems started to arise, however, when ancient Near Eastern scholars started to highlight the differences rather than the similarities. In other words, similarities are easy to find if you really want to find them. If you want to.
It's kind of interesting. When Wes first popped up on the scene, I didn't know who he was till he did the video on Neil from Gnostic Informant, and then we had Kip Davis react to this stream, and he mentions a lot of the ancient Near Eastern scholars noticing the differences. And I'm like, how many ancient Near Eastern scholars has Wes talked to? Just kind of curious. Like, I'm not an expert, but the ones that I do talk to who specialize on this stuff, they don't like see the differences and go, you know, the differences between these texts. Yeah, there's nothing. They didn't borrow. Like they don't say that. And even the ones who say it's not a direct descendant, like Genesis is not borrowing from a direct Enuma Elish, like Joel Baden. Joel Baden then adds the caveat of saying, if Enuma Elish was never written, Genesis would not have existed ever. So he's not saying Genesis borrowed directly from Enuma Elish, though there are scholars who do think it, like David Carr, which I recently interviewed, and of course was recommended by Joshua Bowen beforehand to pull up his book, because in his book, he covers some of this and we may get time to get into it. But like, it's just sloppy to me and not actually painting an accurate picture of what the scholarship seems to be saying. That's important to me. I want people to know what the scholars actually say, not make up something to protect your book, but just let the scholars speak. And if they have differences, and they do, let that speak. But they do not disagree on inspiration and influence in this tradition clearly coming down into the Bible, that the Bible is late in regards to this tradition.
You can find some pretty fascinating similarities between ancient Mayan and ancient Greek mythology. The same goes for religious ceremonial practices of the Vikings and religious practices of the Aztecs. However, the Mayans didn't borrow and rework Greek mythology any more than the Aztecs did with the Vikings.
So I don't personally, I understand he's trying to pull up the Parallelomania card, but really that's unfortunate, because you just got done explaining how critical scholars have pointed out that Jews, if we could just use the term anachronistically, you understand what I mean. The people who are writing and crafting stories here were escorted from the land they were in into Babylon. We have historical records of this. You just gave like really, really clear evidence to suggest these people were under an empire that these stories reigned supreme in. So why are you jumping to Mayan culture when there's literally like all of this separation to find generic commonalities as an argument when you know they were under there eating and speaking and reading and breathing the same air as the people who have these stories? It's not the same. This is no comparison, in my opinion. I just don't find that. I find that kind of silly. Anyway, we got a super chat. Victor, I did not see it till just now. Thank you so much for the love and the support. Let me come back to me for a second. You said, I compared Noah and Gilgamesh line for line. The same things happen in the same order. Noah not being a direct copy is ridiculous. Okay. So you think it's a direct copy. You're going to see some things I bring up here on a parallel chart that show where Gilgamesh doesn't have certain things that Noah does, but the Atrahasis Epic does have certain things that Gilgamesh doesn't. And so this makes me wonder if the redactors of P and non-P, as the scholars call it, priestly source and non-priestly source, because Genesis has different traditions patched together. It's not one book. It's not one story. There are different authors clearly writing narratives, and these narratives aren't, compatible in many cases. A lot of them are contradictory or completely separate traditions that aren't meant to be the same exact tradition. You can see developments of that. Genesis 1, Garden of Eden story, Genesis 2-3, or you could see it with the genealogy, for example, with Cain and Abel, but then you have another genealogy with Seth, and that one goes to Noah, right? So there's a different genealogy, and how those play out is interesting. Dan McClellan did some interesting videos recently covering some of this stuff that I find fascinating. But I'm with you in the sense that it's obvious the Bible is inspired, copying, borrowing from Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, these earlier Mesopotamian stories, no doubt. I wouldn't say it's like verbatim in any way, right? There may be some elements that you could say, hey, that pitch thing, you kept that specific term that we find in these earlier stories, and that's a huge giveaway. Or the three birds motif, which we'll get into, that's important, I think. Anyone who's going to study this stuff, you have to really pay attention to that. But yeah, Victor, I'm curious to know what you specifically have side by side and how that looks in a chart. Be happy to see that if you could send that to me, brother. All right, I'm going to keep going here with Wes Huff. Here we go.
The geographical and time differences between these types of parallels, although one could easily draw the lines, proves one point and one point specifically. It's easy to ignore the conflict of details and capitalize on the resemblances. It's the differences that make the difference. Correlation does not equal causation.
How many times have we heard that from apologetics, right? Now, don't get me wrong. It's true. Correlation doesn't equal causation, but the way it gets used, it gets used as a weapon against actual scholarship that points out really good data to support that Genesis is borrowing.
Kind of like how Advil and arsenic both come in pill form, but it isn't the similarities that make the difference when I'm deciding on what to reach for when I have a headache.
Oh my God.
Philologists study this, and the Babylonian parallels with the biblical stories have pointed out for decades that linguistic parallels between, say, the biblical flood story and something like the Epic of Gilgamesh are realistically more superficial than they are outright. The existence of vague similarities does not then mean that you can necessarily draw a straight line in origin or even influence from one to the other. Now, some might argue that those aren't fair comparisons. After all, there wasn't any cultural intermingling going on between the Vikings and the Aztecs, where there was a clear time, cultural, and religious overlap between the ancient Israelites and other Mesopotamian nations. This is true, and may be a fair objection. However, once
it is a fair objection. It is a fair objection. Hate to break it to you, buddy. Just keeping it real.
Again, we need to make sure we're taking our crossovers on a case-by-case basis and not still violating the correlation causation fallacy. The obvious examples are that of the stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they're not origin accounts like the beginning of the book of Genesis is. The Babylonians had an origin story called the Enuma Elish, and it is as opposite in its intention and narrative from Genesis as you could possibly get. It's also...
Oh my God. Yeah, so he will look at the differences and let those differences dictate. But what do you do with the scholars like David Carr and other experts who read these languages? Like, this is the thing. I'm not an expert. I've always said this and always will be. And if I come off a bit strong, it's because I really do have a team I'm rooting for, and I'm very strong-minded, and that is the critical scholars, okay? They read Hebrew, they read the Akkadian, they read Sumerian language, they read the various Semitic languages, of course, Canaan, etc. They know the material, right? And they're the ones talking. And you would think someone who's studying Greek specifically, his focus would be getting into Greek and dealing with manuscript traditions, as he says, as someone who is looking at the early New Testament material. You would think, like, if you're going to school and you know how serious this stuff is and how difficult it is to acquire this knowledge, the experts in that area, you would think someone like Wes, who's going to school, would look at them and go, hey, hats off to you. You guys are the ones who know your shit about this. I don't. But when I do videos, anyone who's watched for a long time, let me come back to me for a second here, and I can't see in case someone super chats. So I do not pretend it's me. I do sometimes throw out things like I speculate with an academic, but I don't pretend that I'm the one who like read the primary sources in the original languages and have come up with these ideas. No. And I also don't pretend to object to all the critical scholars that are out there on those ideas. If I do have a persuasion, it's because someone with PhDs has been inspiring me to think a certain way, but I'm never closed off to the alternatives that other experts have in the field. This right here, what he's doing is apologetics. I don't know any other way to put it. He's just defending the Bible to try and keep it from having that inspiration. And sure, while some scholars are much more careful and going, yeah, Genesis may not be directly borrowing this episode, and here's why I can't prove the connection. The overlap is so obvious that they have either a common source in literary form, oral form, or they used Gilgamesh or some other form of Atrahasis or something, and they gave it a spin. And that happens all the time. If not, where did these details come from? Because some of the details are way too obvious for it to be coincidence. It's clear. Since like 1870 something, George, let me share my screen, come back to y'all here in just a second. This is important. George, what do I have over here? Let's see. Yeah, 1872, December 3rd. A self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith. Let me zoom in here for you so you can see this, right? These guys, like, they figured out, right? There was the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London and read a translation of a cuneiform tablet that would fundamentally alter biblical scholarship forever. In the audience sat British Prime Minister William Gladstone and the Archbishop of Canterbury, a measure of just how anticipated this announcement was. What Smith had found among the thousands of unsorted tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh was tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story of a great flood, complete with a man warned by a god to build a boat, loading animals aboard, surviving a catastrophic deluge, landing on a mountain, sending out birds, and offering sacrifice. The parallels to Noah's flood in Genesis were unmistakable. And this is a quote, Smith took the tablet and began to read over the lines which the conservator had brought to light. And when he saw that they contained the portion of the legend he had hoped to find there, he jumped up and rushed about the room in a great state of excitement, and to the astonishment of those present, began to undress himself. He's trying to reverse Adam and Eve. He wants to get back to his naked state. The sensation was immediate and global. The New York Times ran a front page. This is since 1876. When will apologists get with the latest, greatest? I mean, they've already recognized there's something going on, right? That early, right? 100, almost 200 years ago, it seems. Let me see. Yeah. I mean, we're going on 150 to 200 years. They've already had this discovered, right? And then they built upon it. Here's what most people don't know, though. Scholars have since discovered that even the Gilgamesh flood story was borrowed from an even older source. And he doesn't bring this up as a point. He just focuses on Gilgamesh. the Atrahasis Epic, dating to approximately 1700 BCE. The trail of literary dependence runs deeper than Smith could have imagined. Why this matters. We now possess multiple Mesopotamian flood narratives: the Sumerian Ziud Sudra Epic, 1600 BCE, the Atrahasis Epic, 1700 BCE, and the Gilgamesh Tablet 11, 1200 to 1000 BCE, all of which predate the earliest possible date for any biblical text by centuries to over a millennium. The parallels are not vague, they are specific, structural, and sequential. And he wants to hand wave them away. That's a problem. That's a problem. So if we want to play common source game, that's fine. It's still coming from a common source legend that we don't have. If you can't buy that it came from Gilgamesh or Atrahasis or Eridu Genesis or something, okay, dude, we've lost a source, a pagan source that has the elements we know comes from the tradition of the pagan sources from Babylon, and your Genesis came late and it borrowed from that source. Or it's oral and they copied it from an oral tradition, as some want to try and say. Either way you slice this pizza, either way you slice it, it is dependent on an earlier tradition of myth that is polytheistic to its core, that is clearly more archaic than the boat style Noah has built in his Genesis account, and so many other elements. There's just so many problems. All right, back to Wes Huff and his apologetics.
It's also useful to point out that a lot of the comparisons, whether we're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Tale of Adapa, the Clay Enki tablet, the Eridu flood account, as well as a few others from the ancient Near East, are all fragmentary, either what's left over for us to read or pertaining to there being multiple scattered versions of the same story. There isn't necessarily one story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but rather several fragmentary accounts that differ quite significantly with one another. When I talk about the details of the epic, what I'm referring to is the latest and most complete version of the 7th century BC, found in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. In this final standardized form, the Epic of Gilgamesh follows the account of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. When looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have a number of possible candidates for biblical overlap. The main plot of the story is that Gilgamesh, a king, is hated by his people. And right at the beginning of the epic, the gods create a man named Enkidu, a wild man who lives in and amongst the wildlife of the forest. Eventually, the gods send a prostitute to bring him back to the city of Uruk in an effort to civilize him and befriend Enkidu.
So nothing wrong with this. Nothing wrong. I'm just going to make this clear. I need to come back to, we're going to get to Enkidu in just a second. I got to show you something, but I want you to know, look, there's nothing wrong with this. He's reading a teleprompt or a script. Okay. So he wants to make sure he probably doesn't make any errors based on what he thinks is accurate here. And I know he is explaining the fact that there is a tradition of Gilgamesh, and we do have a latest version that has a compilation of this together. Tablet 11, of course, is where you're going to find the flood narrative. But he is reading something here. This isn't just hip fire stuff. I don't know. I notice that stuff because I do I have a teleprompter that allows me to read my scripts often, especially if they get into the weeds. This is all hip fire. So I'm going to make mistakes as we're talking, but the whole gist of what I'm saying is spot on, just so everybody understands. I'm not the one making up these claims about what the scholars are saying. But Enkidu, let's hear what he has to say, and then I want to show you something.
Him and befriend Enkidu. The prostitute befriends and sleeps with Enkidu for a period of time, slowly integrating ideas of culture and civilized behavior. The more he takes on these concepts, the less the animals interact with him, communicating that Enkidu is becoming enculturated and no longer like the wild beasts of the fields. This is the story that some have drawn similarities with regarding the creation story of Adam and Eve at the beginning of Genesis. At first, they live in the Garden of Eden, interacting and lording over the animals. However, after eating of the forbidden fruit, they are excommunicated from the garden. It's then only a few chapters later in Genesis 4 that the rise of culture and civilization takes hold. If we follow the succession of the story of the epic, we see that after Enkidu's death later in the story, Gilgamesh becomes confronted with his own mortality.
Okay, we're going to get off topic here. He's already going to take us off topic. We can't get off topic. My myth visionary friends, we cannot get off topic. We have to deal with Enkidu for a second, okay? I have to read you something. He skipped something very important. If you're trying to address and still man the position of what's going on, we need to see what Gilgamesh has to say. So this is important, right? You go up a little bit. Let's go up just to show you. I'm going to zoom in here. Everyone needs to see this. If you had any questions about this, hopefully your thirst is quenched when you see what I'm talking about. All right. So you got these hunters, these hunters are out in the woods. They're in the wilderness trying to get their food. They end up, let me see, a notorious trapper came face to face. Here we are. So I want to show you something. This is important. In the wilderness, she created valiant Enkidu. We need to go up a little higher. There's so much here. Enkidu, when Aruru, let's just go here. When Aruru heard this, she created within herself a Zikert of Anu. Aruru washed her hands. She pinched off some clay and threw it into the wilderness. In the wilderness, she created valiant Enkidu, born of silenced. Notice she pinched off some clay. Okay, so even Enkidu's made out of clay, just like Adam. But let's get into some details you need to see so you can understand this isn't just generic. There's something very important that he missed that is in Gilgamesh. This is a translation of Gilgamesh. I don't know whose translation, but this is Gilgamesh. You can get it online. Uruk-warka.dk/Gilgamesh. All right. In the wilderness, she created valiant Enkidu, born of silence, endowed with strength by Ninurta. His whole body was shaggy with hair. He had a full head of hair like a woman. His locks billowed in profusion like Ashnan. He knew neither people nor settled living, but wore a garment like Sumakan. He ate grasses with the gazelles and jostled at the watering hole with the animals. As with animals, his thirst was slaked with mere water. Now, this is important because beer gets introduced later, you'll see, but he is living with animals. There is no woman in his life. He has not had a woman made for him. Adam and Eve, okay? You could see why Eve gets created, but first, before Eve, if you read the narrative, Adam is with animals alone. Adam is there with animals. There's no woman in his life at that moment in the Genesis account. A notorious trapper came face to face with him opposite the watering hole. A first, a second, and a third day, he came face to face with him opposite the watering hole. On seeing him, the trapper's face went stark with fear, and he, Enkidu, and his animals drew back home. He was rigid with fear. Though stock still, his heart pounded and his face drained of color. He was miserable to the core, and his face looked like one who had made a long journey. The trapper addressed his father, saying, "Father, a certain fellow has come from the mountains. He is the mightiest in the land. His strength is as mighty as the meteorite of Anu. He continually goes over the mountains. He continually jostles at the watering place with the animals. He continually plants his feet opposite the watering place. I was afraid, so I did not go up to him. He filled in the pits that I had dug, wrenched out my traps that I had spread, released my grasp the wild animals." So he's trying to trap animals. "He does not let me make my rounds in the wilderness." He's a hunter. The trapper's father spoke to him, saying, "My son, there lives in Uruk a certain Gilgamesh. There is no one stronger than he. He is as strong as the meteorite of Anu. Go, set off to Uruk. Tell Gilgamesh of this man of might. He will give you the harlot Shamhat. Take her with you, the prostitute, with you. This woman will overcome the fellow as if she were strong. When the animals are drinking at the watering place, have her take off her robe and expose her sex. When he sees her, he will draw near to her, and his animals who grew up in the wilderness will be alien to him." So the animals won't be his companions any longer once he consummates this relationship with this woman. He heeded his father's advice. The trapper went off to Uruk. He made the journey, stood inside of Uruk, and declared to Gilgamesh, "There is a certain fellow who has come from the mountains. He is the mightiest of the land. His strength is as mighty as the meteorite of Anu. He continually goes." It usually repeats. That's just how this epic goes, which is poetic and it's fun. Okay, we're going to skip that since we already read that. Gilgamesh said to the trapper, "Go, trapper, bring the harlot Shamhat with you. When the animals are drinking at the watering place, have her take off her robe and expose her sex. When he sees her, he will draw near to her, and his animals who grew up in the wilderness will be alien to him." The trapper went, bringing the harlot Shamhat with him. They set off on the journey, making direct way. On the third day, they arrived at the appointed place, and the trapper and the harlot sat down at their posts. A first day and a second, they sat opposite the watering hole. The animals arrived and drank at the watering hole. The wild beast arrived and slaked their thirst with water. Then he, Enkidu, offspring of the mountains, who eats grasses with the gazelles, came to drink at the watering hole with the animals. With the wild beast, he slaked his thirst with water. Then Shamhat saw him, a primitive, a savage fellow from the depths of the wilderness. "That is he, Shamhat. Release your clenched arms. Expose your sex so he can take in your voluptuousness. Do not be restrained. Take his energy. When he sees you, he will draw near to you. Spread out your robe so he can lie upon you and perform this primitive, I think they might have butchered this, and perform this primitive task of womanhood. His animals who grew up in the wilderness will become alien to him, and his lust will groan over you. Shamhat unclinched her bosom, exposed her sex, and he took in her voluptuousness. She was not restrained, but took his energy. She spread out her robe, and he lay upon her. She performed for the primitive the task of womanhood. His lust groaned over her. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu stayed aroused and had intercourse with the harlot until he was sated with her charms. But when he turned his attention to his animals, the gazelle saw Enkidu and darted off. He's not an animal. He's not a wild man anymore. This guy is changed. Something happened to him, right? The wild animals distanced themselves from his body. Enkidu, his utterly depleted body, his knees that wanted to go off with his animals went rigid. Enkidu was diminished. His running was not as before. But then he drew himself up, for his understanding had broadened. Turning around, he sat down at the harlot's feet and gazed into her face, his ears attentive as the harlot spoke. The harlot said to Enkidu, "You are beautiful, Enkidu. You are become like a god." Enkidu, in the process of the woman and, of course, the intercourse, has no longer the wild nakedness nature he once had with the animals in the wilderness, is now becoming civilized, is now becoming a human. And the woman causes him to now become like a god. Now, I understand Genesis is narrating this differently. But that key moment here, when Wes Huff is explaining this, that he has become like a god, that very, very detailed, even if you think, I'm sorry, it's too generic, is important to mention, because those elements are no doubt earlier than Genesis and obviously inspiring in some way the ideas we find in Genesis. Even if you weren't bought on a direct dependence on Gilgamesh, this theme in Mesopotamia, becoming like a god, the whole nine, is what Genesis is borrowing from and trying to subvert in many ways. It is reacting and making a difference. That's the whole point. But it won't make a difference if it isn't imitating the tradition. You can't just say it's not only different, but it's also making a difference from the prior theology that is known in the Babylonian Empire that we were conquered by. It needs to have the similarities in order to emphasize the differences. That is the point of Genesis 1 through 11. And what I think every scholar, even the ones who don't think it's genetically copying this particular text, all the consensus agrees on this. There's not a single critical New Testament or Old Testament scholar that I know of who denies this, unless you were finding them at a seminary and they're apologist or something. I can't imagine a real serious academic who knows Hebrew Bible ever denying the ideas that I'm describing here. They may deny Enuma Elish, direct dependence, Gilgamesh, direct dependence, Atrahasis, direct dependence. They do not deny the tradition. They do not deny that this is borrowing from that Mesopotamian stuff. So I wanted to emphasize that. Now back to you, ladies and gentlemen, just to make sure I catch you guys. Look, idiots in the chat here. We got people who have no clue what they're talking about right here. Literally. You can't say it was stolen. You missed the beginning. I did say it was stolen on purpose. Golly, dude. I don't know why so many like out there people are in the chat all the time. There's so much. I really wish I had more engagement from people who are into this stuff, actually into real scholarship, not some conspiracy nonsense or, all of that. All right, I'm going to keep reacting to what Wes Huff says. Let me get that back up.
And goes on a long journey to find Utnapishtim, an immortal, to find out how he, Gilgamesh, can obtain immortality. When Gilgamesh meets with Utnapishtim, it's then that we get probably the most common story connected with the biblical narrative. As Gilgamesh talks with Utnapishtim, he's told about the Great Flood. And Gilgamesh is told that Utnapishtim was commissioned by the gods to build a boat to survive the storm. Afterwards, he makes a burnt sacrifice to feed the gods, and they're so pleased with this action that they grant him eternal life on Earth. This story is also accepted to be only part of...
I don't have any disagreements with that. I mean, there's just so much more to the story than what he's doing. He's just giving a recap. But I think that detail that I brought up earlier is important when you actually read the source. That Enkidu has become like a god. He clearly, his face is showing that. And there was another book that was recommended to me, we'll get to in a moment, by Dan McClellan about this, that goes into how ancient Mesopotamians would build images of gods, and they would have a ritual ceremony where they would, and I'm talking about the scholar he recommended, their book goes into this, where they do a ritual ceremony where they bring that god to birth. The god gets birthed technically, and its eyes open up, its ears open. It is now clearly a divinity at this point. Now we're talking ancient. We're talking 2,000 years, 1,000 years before the Bible even. I mean, they're already doing this stuff way, way back there. What Genesis is doing, as it's written much later, is different. It's new. It's unique. All right, here we go. Let's let Wes keep cooking.
The latest version of the epic. It's actually missing from the earlier iterations, and it differs linguistically from the rest of the tale in style, opening formulas, and vocabulary. So were these particular stories stolen or at minimum borrowed to create the biblical accounts? I don't think so, and neither do the majority of ancient Near Eastern scholars if you actually read their assessments of the theory. In fact, some scholars think that the flood account in the epic does come from a precursor in an Akkadian writing from the 18th century BC called the Atrahasis. Whereas the parallels are surfaced between Genesis and Gilgamesh, many of the stylistic choices, grammar, and syntax from the late version of Gilgamesh match with the Atrahasis word for word. We can be confident that the biblical authors didn't borrow from Gilgamesh, as Gilgamesh appears to be from the...
So he's trying to show that Gilgamesh is dependent on... So here is Wes Huff, right? Notice the move here. Genesis isn't borrowing from Gilgamesh, but he's quick to point a scholar, quote a scholar. And you saw this, right? Let me go back here. I wonder if this scholar that he quotes, which I would love to go look up, this scholar right here, Jeffrey Tigay, The Evolution of Gilgamesh Epic, 214 to 220. I seriously wonder if this scholar would agree with him that Genesis isn't inspired by Gilgamesh and Atrahasis and Enuma maybe on Genesis 1. Would he disagree with David Carr? Would he disagree with many of these scholars who actually are highlighting this material? John Day? What about these guys? But notice Wes is very comfortable with saying, yeah, Gilgamesh is borrowing from Atrahasis, which he's correct on. But like, there's this immediate distance between Genesis and that material. But like, nobody has a problem with the traditions borrowing from each other and going back. Of course, that's not a problem. It's only a problem when it's the Bible. It's crazy to me.
Are surfaced between Genesis and Gilgamesh. Many of the stylistic choices, grammar, and syntax from the late version of Gilgamesh match with the Atrahasis word for word. We can be confident that the biblical authors didn't borrow from Gilgamesh, as Gilgamesh appears to be from the Atrahasis. If for no other reason, then we have a long and storied history of the Jews, and particularly the Jewish scribal community, being completely repulsed by the ancient paganism around them. Stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh are narratives that specifically claim that the rule and authority of gods are prominent over Yahweh. Not only that, but for the Israelites to look at a story about a wild man who is created by multiple gods and a prostitute sent to seduce him, and then do a bait and switch with those characters, transforming them into a perfect man and a perfect woman, set up to be priests and representatives of the Almighty God in his sacred garden, rather than a wild man and a prostitute, seems, for lack of a better way of putting it, silly to me. The whole narrative about Enkidu dying, Gilgamesh pursuing eternal life, which he finds out he can achieve temporarily by swimming to the bottom of the ocean to find a plant, which is then stolen by a snake while he sleeps, and then that plant is believed to be replaced by the Israelites, who are stealing the story with a tree and fruit, move to the beginning of the story, not the end, and then the snake doesn't steal the life-giving plant like in Gilgamesh. He simply talks to our main characters in the biblical story and convinces them to eat of a different fruit from a different tree. And that's not even mentioning a whole host of other details that are essential to the epic, but that we don't find anywhere in the Bible.
You know, I really would be curious to see someone read Gilgamesh and then read Atrahasis and see how different they are. Let's highlight how many differences there are between Atrahasis Epic that he just confessed is clearly the antecedent for Gilgamesh, and then see how many differences Gilgamesh has in his narrative form and the differences and how they're not the same. And then once we do that, maybe he'll change his mind and stop saying Gilgamesh is dependent upon Atrahasis. I mean, how silly of Wes to think that this would be borrowing, since there's so many differences between what Atrahasis Epic story tells and then what the Gilgamesh story tells. Duh. I mean, Come on. Using the same logic, you'd run into a problem. But there's so many issues at the end of the day that scholars point out that he's not addressing in this quick video. And I think that's why we're going to have to turn to some of these scholars and get what they have to say.
Problem is the theory that the ancient Israelites stole, borrowed, or outright plagiarized these types of ancient Mesopotamian narratives operates on making a whole lot of...
So he literally, just notice, this is why I titled my video Stolen, okay? Because I watched this before I actually made the video.
That the ancient Israelites stole, borrowed, or outright plagiarized these types...
Stole, borrowed, or outright plagiarized. So he puts borrowing in the same vein as stole or plagiarized. That's why I titled my video, The Noah's Flood Was Stolen. And if you look, I have scare quotes, of course, on the title. The whole point is, no, this gives it kind of a motive of like a negative motive, right? Maybe Wes is responding to like internet atheists who might use this to try and weaponize, it stole it. And it's like, no, it is clearly a common story that people would adapt and change. And we know this, even all the way down into the Alexander Romance legends. They're borrowing Gilgamesh to write the Alexander legends that we read about. Gilgamesh is like the template for it. So that's way into the Common Era even. This goes down all the way to the time of the Quran. And that's how important Gilgamesh was. So notice if you go read that story, he would just see the differences. And would he defend the Alexander Romance legends as not lifting from Gilgamesh? Well, they're so different in so many ways. Instead of a plant, it's a fish that gives immortality. There's so many things you can see that are differences. That would make him run away, or would he be okay with it like he is with Atrahasis and Gilgamesh? Because it's not Bible. It's not canon. It's not my Protestant sacred tradition that I have to have these 66 books protected and not be inspired by outside sources. That's kind of what I feel like's going on.
Of ancient Mesopotamian narratives operates on making a whole lot of gratuitous assumptions and ignores the details, flow of each narrative, and theological and historical presuppositions that they operate on. Are there similarities? Sure, but there are similarities between myself and Jean-Claude Van Damme. That doesn't mean I'm a younger version of him. Capitalizing on parallels while at the exact same time ignoring the differences, as I said earlier, can lead to a bit of an exercise in futility.
So nobody needs to ignore the differences, ladies and gentlemen. We need to actually focus mostly on the differences. But if you don't see the parallels, you won't even know what Genesis is up to. You don't really get what it's doing. That's what the scholars are pointing out. That's why the differences are so important, because now you know why this author's writing in contrary, if you will, in reaction to. Civilization is the ziggurat. It's the peak. It's building the ziggurat, right? That's the Tower of Babel. That's civilization. That is godly and good. It gets you closer to the gods. All of that is good in Mesopotamian society. The nomadic Israelites, the Jews who are writing this material, are saying, no, you want to be nomadic. You want to be a shepherd. You don't want to be going towards civilization. You don't want that. You want the opposite of that. And so they're reacting to these kinds of ideas. We want to be in the wilderness to hear his still small voice. That's what they want. That is why agriculture is poo-pooed upon by Cain, or Cain is the one with the agriculture, and Abel is the one who's doing the sacrificing, which may actually already involve the idea of a temple to Yahweh and burnt offerings and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of material through Genesis 1 through 11 alone, which tells you why it's doing what it's doing. And it is a polemic against the Babylonian background in which it comes from.
There are patterns in all sorts of things, but that doesn't mean that those patterns are the cause, making, origin, or agent of others. They could be. We actually do see that between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis. And there are obvious themes and motifs shared throughout the ancient Near East. But finding direct causation requires more than a surface level similarity, which is all we truly find between Genesis and these other ancient Near Eastern stories.
Did he even give any actual causal relationship between Atrahasis and Gilgamesh in this video? I didn't hear any. He just named a scholar. Well, I can do that really, really well. And in fact, I brought like 4 different scholars to the table, but specifically addressing this, 2, and one that, well, actually 3, and one that really gets in the weeds, and it's probably the most exhaustive account of precursors to the Genesis account for these legends, these myths that we're reading. And that proves my point. No, we're going to have to read what the scholars say about it. And I'm not saying he couldn't have. He could have probably elaborated on that and shown what that scholar says, but he ignored what actual scholars have to say about Genesis and just gave his own little, like, don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, it's cool. Genesis isn't borrowing. He used the word stolen and plagiarism, so I had to use it, and I did. All right, let's go. Instead of playing that little outro, I want to go over to some sources. We've already read Gilgamesh just in one spot, and if you have not read the Epic of Gilgamesh, if you have a hard time reading books, some people do. I mean, people are watching YouTube, are getting entertainment and enjoyment that way. I have a video where I actually go over the entire Epic of Gilgamesh in like not every detail of the story, but I do go over, let's see, Gilgamesh. Oh, what happened? What did I just do? Bear with me. Okay. Myth Vision Gilgamesh. I'll put it in the chat. But I narrate the actual story here, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It has over 500,000 views from 1 year ago. And I cover this, and at the end, I take some time to show you some parallels between the Bible, and these parallels are actually what scholars have highlighted, some interesting parallels. I'll put this in the chat. And if you haven't, I recommend it, because I almost came to tears listening to the Epic of Gilgamesh. There was so much human connection that I had to the story of that epic that just really made me go, wow, everyone in the world needs to know this story. So I put that in there so you can actually check that out and listen to me narrate. I try my best to get really emotional with it too, so you can try to feel the emotions of the author. Let's go back to this actually. So if you haven't read Irving Finkel's book, The Ark Before Noah, Decoding the Story of the Flood, Irving Finkel is awesome. We're going to hear him say something quite interesting, actually, at the end of this Lex Friedman episode. So let's start it back here, 20 minutes. And you really need to know this because he has an interesting way of interpreting what's happening in the flood narrative.
Authentic to really connect with people.
Well, you couldn't pull it wool over their eyes. I mean,
Well, I wish many of the films in Hollywood today would have the same level of rigor.
Rigor is one of the things lacking in the world.
By the way, I forgot to ask, why was the flood myth focused on noisy people?
Well, it can't really be noisy. I tell you what the explanation is. It's something quite different. Before the flood, the gods had not created death.
Notice this. This is before the Bible. Death hadn't entered the world with, Adam and Eve, death enters the world, right? In the earlier flood traditions, death did not exist. So there's all these humans we've heard, they're just angry because they're loud, right? Irving Finkel says death hasn't been created yet. It hasn't happened yet. So humans are probably reproducing, making tons of noise because there's too many of them because they can't die off. It's like population control, if you will. And this is what he seems to be implying.
So I think the noise was a reflex of the fact there were just too many animals, too many people, and they had to do something about it. So it's a sort of euphemism, so to speak, because after the flood, at the end of the tablet, not my tablet, but the other ones, where it's still broken, it says there's a tantalizing thing where they create barren women and who can't have children, and men who can't have children, and priestesses who don't have children.
Listen to that. So after the flood, at the end of one of the tablets that are often broken off, in the tablet he said he has, it's saying the gods after that flood create barren women, barren men, barren priestesses, people who can't reproduce. And this is an explanation for maybe the fact that there were too many people and it was like population control by the gods. That's why they're noisy. It wasn't the noise itself. It seems it was the fact that they couldn't die out and there's too many of them and they got to find a way to get rid of humans. That seems to be the explanation. Yes, they're noisy. It probably did irritate Enlil in his high holy place saying, damn it, I can't sleep, because the gods slept. They would rest. just like the God in Genesis rests after his creation and whatnot. And every seventh day they're supposed to rest. This Sabbath meaning rest.
And they institute in society some figures who will not reproduce the species. So it's actually a rather sophisticated Malthusian kind of philosophical position. It's remarkable. So that the noise means there's so many of them. Not that they're actually so noisy that we can't hear ourselves think.
So there's a lot there. I thought that was a really interesting clip that is on Lex Friedman's YouTube channel. And I want to go back to, without having to play, some of the material I brought. So we got Gilgamesh. We've got the Atrahasis stuff. And here's a chronological case of who wrote what and when. Timeline of the flood narratives. The earliest attested dates. So you have the Sumerian Kings list, which references a flood as historical divider, right? 2100 to 1900 BCE. It's the earliest written references to a great flood, and it distinguishes before and after the deluge. You have the Atrahasis Epic, Old Babylonian version, which we've been talking about. It's the oldest flood narrative with creation plus flood. The Ark tablet is from the same tradition. Let's look at the Ark tablet that I made a visual of, okay? Interesting thing that Irving Finkel noticed in this Ark tablet that predates by far what we see in our Bible, right? If you look right here on the right in red, now notice this is a flood read wall, Atrahasis, pay heed to my advice that you may live forever. Top left, ladies and gentlemen. Destroy your house, build a boat, spurn property, and save life. Draw out the boat that you will make on a circular plan. Let her length and breadth be equal. Let her float. And it gives all the dimensions, et cetera, right? And then there's a lower ledge going between her ribs, the itu bitumen. Bitumen, that you're talking about bitumen. You're talking about the very stuff, the material that seals off the ark that Noah uses, that you find in Atrahasis, that you find in Gilgamesh. Same thing, right? Bitumen. All right. Then on the right here, I applied the outside kapru bitumen from the kilns out of the 120 gur measures which the workmen had put on the side. But the wild animals from the steppe, 2 by 2, the boat did they enter. This is something Irving Finkel noted, that in Genesis, the animals are 2 by 2 entering the ark. Here you have them 2 by 2 entering the ark. That's not counting the release of the 3 birds. That's not counting the bitumen that is a hapax legomenon in the Hebrew, specifically dealing with sealing the ark so water doesn't get in. There are so many elements that seem to be obviously borrowing from this tradition to act like this is just generic and that there's not some influence and inspiration from the far older epics that we see here. Going from the Sumerian Kings list, Atrahasis Epic, Sumerian Eridu Genesis, Old Babylonian Gilgamesh Epic, Standard Babylonian Gilgamesh Epic, flooded added around 1200 to 1000 BCE. Earliest possible writings, J-source for the Bible, right, is 950 to 600, according to the consensus of critical scholars. And then the priestly source, flood narrative, 550 to 450-ish, right, is roughly what the consensus holds to. There are some who go further and maybe think a little later, but like we're talking consensus scholarship that is like critical of the Hebrew Bible. And they're all saying, hey, look how late the Bible is versus all of this tradition before it. Come on. What are we doing? Why are we playing games? And they're talking about Mayans. And trying to get away from like the commonality, but then in the same video, you literally point out how Gilgamesh is borrowing from Atrahasis. That's a problem to me. It doesn't sound like you're doing real scholarship. So notice a critical detail. The Old Babylonian Gilgamesh, 1800 BCE, did not include a flood story. The flood narrative was added later when Sinleki Unini compiled the standard Babylonian version, 1200 to 1000 BCE, borrowing it from the Atrahasis tradition. This means the Atrahasis epic is the true origin point of the written flood tradition, not Gilgamesh. Even taking the most conservative date for the Yahweh source, 950 BCE, the Atrahasis tradition is still 750 to 1,000 years older. If we accept the more common critical dating of J to the 7th and 6th centuries BC and P to the exilic period, the gap widens dramatically. The priestly source, which was likely written in Babylon during the exile, had direct access to the very culture that produced these flood narratives. And there's a lot more here. There's a chain of literary dependence to show the Sumerian flood traditions, causing Eridu Genesis, Ziud Sudra, to Atrahasis Epic. Then you get this Epic of Gilgamesh Tablet 11, and oral and scribal traditions circulating throughout ancient Near East. And you have Bible, right? Genesis 6 through 9. How we know Gilgamesh borrowed from Atrahasis, this isn't speculation. Gilgamesh Epic's flood story in Tablet 11 copies portions of the Atrahasis text nearly word for word in several places. The flood hero, Utnapishtim, even calls Atrahasis twice, Utnapishtim is called Atrahasis twice within the Gilgamesh text itself, Tablet 11. So that's a very obvious clue. How we know Genesis borrowed from these traditions. As Professor John Day of Oxford has demonstrated, the biblical flood story shows dependence on the Atrahasis tradition, specifically not just Gilgamesh. The evidence is structural, not superficial. Third-person narrative voice. Atrahasis tells the flood in the third person, as does Genesis. Gilgamesh changed it to first person, Utnapishtim narrating. If Genesis only knew Gilgamesh, it would have had to independently change it back to third person. Far simpler to assume Genesis knew the Atrahasis tradition directly. Flood follows creation. In Atrahasis, the flood comes a few generations after the creation of humanity, exactly as in Genesis. In Gilgamesh, the flood story has been ripped from its creation context and inserted into the quest narrative about immortality. There's a 7-day warning. In Atrahasis, the god Enki warns of the flood coming in 7 days. In Gilgamesh, in Genesis, Yahweh gives, J as in the Yahwist, Yahweh gives Noah 7 days warning. Genesis 7:4. In Gilgamesh, the warning comes only 1 day before. Genesis aligns with Atrahasis, not Gilgamesh, in this regard. Animals enter 2 by 2, and this is a recently discovered Atrahasis tablet, the Ark tablet published by Irving Finkel. That's what I showed you guys a minute ago, where it specifies animals entering 2 by 2, matching Genesis exactly. Gilgamesh says nothing about the number of animals. Promise of no more floods. In Atrahasis, the god Ea declares, henceforth, no more flood be brought about, but let people last forever. Genesis has God's identical promise, right? Gilgamesh has no such promise. This is an interesting point to me, just to note that how can you make this idea that it makes me realize that the flood story seems to be more a literary invention. Sure, floods happen all over the world, but I do not take the memory approach that the flood is based on a real actual event that had to have happened around 5,000, 12,000 years ago or something. Just for the simple fact that how could you know in the future another flood like that's catastrophic and worldwide isn't going to happen again? It's more likely that I think they're making a myth. And this is a pre-Diluvian myth to explain the origins of mankind and all sorts of fun origin myth story stuff. So I'm just more open to the idea and thinking, yeah, they're inventing stories about a massive global flood. And yeah, there are local floods all over the place, but let's explain our origins this way instead of pretending this is an ice age memory or something like that, like the melting of the ice age, younger Dryas, etc. I am personally not persuaded that makes more sense of it. Can I prove it? No. Be fruitful and multiply as polemic. After the flood in Genesis, God commands humanity to multiply. Genesis 9:1. In Atrahasis, the gods impose restrictions on reproduction, infertility, infant mortality. As scholar Tigve Frymer-Kinsky noted, Genesis appears to directly polemicize against the Atrahasis conclusion. Nothing comparable appears in Genesis. So that gives a strong case for Atrahasis being in the picture. Then there's a parallel, right? Side by side, you can parallel all of them. You've got a divine, and by the way, pay close attention to the order. In both traditions, the story moves through the exact same stages. Divine anger at humanity. A single man is secretly warned. He received detailed instructions to build a boat. The boat is sealed with bitumen, pitch. His family boards. Animals are loaded. A catastrophic flood destroys all other life. The waters recede. The boat lands on a mountain. Birds are sent out to test the waters. The hero offers a sacrifice. The deity smells the offering and is pleased. A promise or covenant follows regarding the future of humanity. And that is not coincidence. That is a narrative blueprint being followed. I agree. And then you have a side-by-side. You'll see like all of this material. I really need to get like a way to get you this material for members so I could just have this available so people could download this and see it for themselves. All this material from reason for flood, divine warning, advance notice. And you'll notice there are changes. Ethicized, one's more about human wickedness instead of like they're loud and overpopulated. Divine warning, advance notice, command to build, building materials, animals loaded, family brought aboard, doors sealed, catastrophic flood, boat lands on mountain, birds sent out, sacrifice after flood, God smells the offering, promise no more floods, post-flood humanity, heroes reward. And the other interesting thing about this, because there's a lot more material here, is how the lack of data in the prophets talking about Noah, talking about Adam, like this seems like a later story, even from the prophets' perspective. You would think they'd mention more about these early antediluvian characters and stuff. They don't really waste their time at all. It seems they don't know about them yet. So this might be just evidence of a later or a completely different tradition that they had no clue about. And it goes on and on. Okay. Let me come back to you for a moment before I continue. Okay, Victor in the house. Thank you so much for the super chat, Victor. You said, I'm selling a book, Jerry Potter, exactly the same as Harry Potter, but the wizard is named Jerry. The difference proves that it isn't plagiarized. Victor. And then Victor back again with another super chat. Thank you, Victor. Two of every kind. Vinidad Vargard, 228. I don't know about Vinidad Vargard. What is that? Vinidad Vargard 228. Is that like a... I don't know about this. Is that like a scholar or something? Or is it some source? I'm not really sure. Help me out, Victor. What is this? I wish I knew what you're talking about. All right, let me go back over here while I wait for you to give me some more data. So again, get Irving Finkel's book. And I've got something about Enuma Elish in Genesis 1, but it's not the topic of today, just to show you the parallel patterns. And if you're interested in actual scholarly take, I did a live stream a while back addressing this problem that Wes Huff brought up with doctors Kip Davis and Joshua Bowen on this very issue about what's going on in Enuma Elish and Genesis, highlighting the similarities so that you can also then see the differences and why they're so different. And all of that is noted here. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. Again, you might want to take a screenshot of this. I got the translation from Irving Finkel's book. I ran it into a really pretty image, wanted people to be able to see this and be able to read this ancient Ark tablet, which is in Atrahasis tradition. And you can see, like, we've got a pre-Noah flood story with 2x2 boat, 2x2 on the boat entering of animals. And that's important. Okay. This one here. So I was looking at non-biblical precursors to the non-P flood account. And this is from the scholar, where am I at in chat? 154, right? Remember what page 154. This is the formation of Genesis 1 to 11, David M. Carr. So 154 is where we need to be. He probably does the best in terms of synthesizing this together for us to see. Okay, the chapter is chapter 6 for those precursors to the flood narrative. He's building up. And we'll zoom in a second. I just want to get to the spot. You got the relation of the P and the non-P flood narratives. For those who don't know, Noah's flood story looks to be two stories patched together by some later scribe. They're not the same. There's two different accounts put together, just like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 through 3, just like Genesis 4, the genealogy of Abel or Cain and Abel, and the one with Seth. They're two different traditions. by different authors, you see them patching together different stories. Non-biblical precursor to the non-P flood account. And he did it to the P account too. So, in particular, the non-P flood story shares several elements of the Mesopotamian flood tradition evident in Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh. David Carr is saying it does share it with Gilgamesh. For example, there is a long recognized resemblance between the non-P depiction of Noah sending a raven. Let me zoom in for y'all. For example, the non-P depiction of Noah's sending of a raven and then a dove out after the diminishment of the flood in 8:6-12 of the Bible, and the epic or the depiction in Gilgamesh of Utnapishtim sending a dove, sparrow, and raven out at the same point, including a striking close parallel to Gilgamesh 11:150 in Genesis 8:9. In addition, the non-P flood story shares a particular focus on the number 7 with the Gilgamesh version of the flood story. Whereas other versions of the Mesopotamian tradition depict the flood as lasting 7 days, the Gilgamesh version also features a 7-day period of ark construction before the coming of the flood. Another 7-day period separating the end of the flood and Noah's sending of the birds. And an emphasis on 7 in relation to the other Loki. So you got 7 parts of the ark, parts of sacrifice, and of baked bread. The 7 pairs of pure animals brought on the ark in Genesis 7:2. Together, these parallels suggest that the non-P flood narrative is a creative appropriation of a Mesopotamian flood tradition, especially like that in Gilgamesh. Dude, just get this book. The Formation of Genesis 1-11. Biblical and Other Precursors. Highly, highly recommend. David M. Carr. I did an interview with him. I don't think it's public yet. It's going to be public soon. We get into some fun stuff. The guy knows what he's talking about. And he goes on and on, right? Proposed an inter-biblical precursor to the non-P flood account, at least since the Zohar, Noah. Biblical interpreters have noted parallels between the story of Noah and the images of Abraham and Moses as intercessors. And there's your sources. More recent scholarship has multiplied these observations, noting particular links of the non-priestly flood narrative to the story of Moses' intercession for Israel at Sinai. Moses is multiply noted in the Sinai narrative as a privileged intercessor for the people because he has found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. He trades on this status using the same verb for wipe, seen in the non-P flood narrative. I like when scholars go not only outside the Bible, but into the Bible to show you how these authors are actually using this material. And this is going to get into the weeds. See, non-biblical precursors to the priestly flood account. Meanwhile, the P, Noah flood narrative, also shows significant connections to the Mesopotamian flood traditions, including aspects not featured in the non-P flood narrative. To be sure, like the non-P flood narrative, it too lacks the dramatic interaction between gods or any correlates to the scenes with the elders with various builders of the ark. P even lacks a parallel to the final scene of the flood hero's sacrifice. Nevertheless, we do have a preserved version of P's divine instruction to the flood hero to build the ark, and these instructions feature some striking motifs that parallel Mesopotamian flood traditions. The idea that the ark might be constructed in part from reeds, Genesis 6:14, perhaps of the Cain hut temple in which the flood hero heard his patrons warning about the flood. The use of an Akkadian loanword for pitch. This is the important point that I was mentioning earlier. The loan word for pitch in stressing the importance of making the ark watertight. The instructions to make the ark with dimensions corresponding to a sanctuary in P, now the Jerusalem temple, tabernacle rather than the ziggurat of its precursors. So that might be one of the reasons Genesis is also doing this is you've got a Jerusalem temple in response to ziggurat. It's our place, not yours, that is good. And the specific divine instruction provision of food for the animals on the ark. Potential linguistic links to the cuneiform literature continue into the latter half of P's flood narrative, with P's use of an apparent loan word out of Akkadian to describe the closing of the heavenly portals, the hapax legomena, and I can't read Hebrew, but it says in Akkadian Sekiru, I believe. This is all linguistic stuff. I mean, why is this not? How is this not convincing to people like Wes Huff, who claim they're going down the scholarly road, the scholastic path, to realize the Bible's borrowing from earlier traditions to do it, and yet they're quick to jump on it when it comes to those traditions borrowing from each other? Cool, not with the Bible. If there isn't some inherited apologetic reason to raise the Bible above and act like it did not have the human fingerprints of the prior tradition. I just think that's it's coping to me. Okay, another book you definitely got to get is this one. This one goes into it, but I can't say it does the same level of justice the way that David Carr did, but he does a parallel charting. We're going to scroll down just to show you, and I'll show you the name of the book, Between Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and Genesis. And this scholar goes, I got to zoom in for you so you could really see. This scholar goes in, so make sure you get the book. I'll put a link in the comments. I'll try to remember to put this in the description after, but this goes for pages, right? Paralleling the accounts of Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and Genesis with these earlier traditions, right? And showing you side by side. The book is Primeval History, Babylonian, Biblical, and Enochic. And I have not read this. I haven't read this. But this was recommended to me by Dan McClellan. So I think that's a very important book for people to study. Also, Eridu Genesis. We could just read it. I didn't want to waste too much time. I want to come hang out with you guys because you really should go read some of these stories. Then this is actually part of Joshua Bowen's course where he goes through PowerPoint showing. He used some of this on the live stream with me and Kip Davis and him. This is another book you really need to get to understand the image of God in the Garden of Eden and understanding people, how they understood gods and whatnot in earlier Mesopotamian and even Egyptian culture, so that you can wrap your head around, because you've heard it from a ton of apologists. The Bible has a unique understanding of the image of God. No one else has it, and it's a complete way of raising the Bible above every other sacred literature and poo-poo on them. This is the book, The Garden, the image of the garden in the image of God in the Garden of Eden, the creation of humankind in Genesis 2:5 through 3:24. In light of Mispi, I'm going to butcher this, but this was also recommended by Dan McClellan. And another book, this one, I'm the one recommending it because I think it's important we read some of this. All right. And this is none other than Joshua Bowen. So, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. If you haven't already, I've done 1,000,001 interviews with Dr. Bowen. And he wrote this book and pretty much synthesized all sorts of scholarship. You can go to his bibliography, Genesis 6 through 9, the worldwide flood. And we've all seen this, right? He covers the pitch. I would read this, but I really want to come hang out with you guys. He covers all sorts of stuff. There's so many antecedents in Mesopotamia for every aspect just about you see in Genesis 1 through 11. Just about. I think there's a few things I've noted that you see in the Greek tradition of Deucalion that you can find in Genesis that you don't find in any existing prior material, which means maybe there's a common source. Maybe there was an ancient Phoenician tale that we don't have that was an in-between ground of these traditions. I don't know. Either way, Genesis was influenced without a doubt on the earlier Mesopotamian tradition, just as the Greeks were. So, fun stuff, huh? Golly, I would love to read all this, but I really don't want to leave you guys bored. Get the book. If you care about what we're doing here, get the book. Take his course. You can go to the mvp-courses.com. I pinned it in the comments on this video. And myths borrowed by the Old Testament. He goes through Canaanite myths. He goes through Mesopotamian stuff. It's in high quality. You own it for life. You take it at your own pace. It's all in video form as well. I believe there's some downloadable materials in there. And yeah, one other thing we could do in a little while, we might check it out, is my buddy Paul, the Inquisitive Bible Reader. You really have to subscribe to this channel. We might check out the Genesis flood sources and Mesopotamian background, because this guy has edited some of my videos in the past. I paid him to help me edit some of them. My gosh, he has done fantastic work helping MythVision not only with scripting some of the content, but also editing some of the videos. Brilliant, brilliant mind. All right, I'm back to you, ladies and gentlemen. Back to you. Victor, Vinidad, Fargard, 228 is the Zoroastrian Avesta. Ah, okay. So I need to see that. Zoroastrian Avesta. Vinidad. Let me make sure I spelled this right. Vinidad. Fargard. Vinidad. Fargard. 228. There we go. Let's see what it says. Oh, it's going to be kind of beefy here. And that's pretty small to read. Yima, Jamshed, and the Deluge. So there's the Deluge and the Zoroastrian stuff. Translated James Darmestater. Synopsis: this Fargard may be divided into two parts. First parts 1 through 20. Ahura Mazda proposes to Yima, the son of Vivengat, to receive the law from him and to bring it to men. On his refusal, he bids him keep his creatures and make them prosper. Yima accordingly makes them thrive and increase, keeps death and disease away from them, and 3 times enlarges the earth, which had become too narrow for its inhabitants. Second part, 21 to the end. On the approach of a dire winter, which is to destroy every living creature, Yima, being advised by Ahura, builds a Vara to keep there the finest representatives of every kind of animals and plants, and they live there a life of perfect happiness. It's difficult not to acknowledge in the latter legend of Zoroastrian adaptation of the deluge, whether it was borrowed from the Bible or from the Chaldean mythology. The similitude is so striking that it did not escape the Muslims. Look how they spell Muslims. Look at this. It's so funny to see how some people will spell certain names Muslims. And Macaudi states that certain authors place the date of the deluge in the time of Jamshed. There are essential and necessary differences between the two legends, the chief one being that in the monotheistic narration, the deluge is sent as a punishment from God, whereas in the dualistic version, it is a plague from Devas, but the core of the two legends is the same. The hero in both is a righteous man who, forewarned by God, builds a refuge to receive choice specimens of mankind, intended someday to replace an imperfect humanity destroyed by a universal calamity. So it'd be interesting to see what critical scholars have to say about this particular story. Be interesting. Thank you for the super chat. Spiritologist. Do we have a date for when the Bible flood? That's a great question. Exactly when do they date it? Let me actually see, because I imagine they work off of the timelines. So I'm asking ChatGPT, if we worked backwards with the genealogies in the Bible, what date was the flood of Noah? Or how old or how long ago? Let's just do that too. Let's see if it helps me understand. All right. So it's saying you have, okay, I'll give you the 3 historically recognized calculations. So there's 3. Masoretic text, the Bible used in most modern Bibles, Septuagint, LXX, the early Greek, and then you have the Samaritan Pentateuch. These genealogies do not agree, and that's the whole point. So even in the 3 Bibles we have, we can't even really be overly confident on the exact dates. So the Masoretic text date of the flood, according to that, it says 2348 BCE. This date was famously calculated by Bishop James Ussher in 1650, remains the standard date for young Earth creationists because it follows the Masoretic text numbers exactly. How old would that make the flood? 4,374 years ago, counting from 2026. Then the Septuagint is 3,298 BCE, which would be 5,324 years ago. So almost 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text. And then the Samaritan Pentateuch dates at 2900 BCE, 4,900 years ago, which is kind of in between. It's closer to the Masoretic maybe, but it's kind of in between both the Masoretic and the Septuagint. So you get 3 different dates on when the flood supposedly happened according to the Bible's own textual manuscript traditions. They don't agree. based on their genealogies. That's why I love critical scholarship, you know. Which is it, my friends? Which is it, historical believers in the flood? Which text do you go with? The Masoretic? Do you go with the Septuagint? The Samaritan Pentateuch? You know what I mean? Like, so problems, either way you slice it. I didn't read the verse. Well, let's see. This is a long. Let me see if I can't find it. I mean, hopefully I can find it. Let me back out a little bit on this. Bear with me. All right. Let me see if I can't find it on this page. 228, right? Should be under 2 and then 28. Thither thou shalt bring the seeds of every kind of tree, of the highest size and sweetest of odor on this earth. Thither thou shalt bring the seeds of every kind of fruit, the best of savor and sweetest of odor. All those seeds shalt thou bring, 2 of every kind, to be kept inexhaustible there, so long as those men shall stay in the Vara. So you got the 2, again, like the 2 of each kind showing up here in the Avesta. Interesting. There shall be no humpbacked, none bulged forward there, no impotent, no lunatic, no maliciousness, no liar, no one spiteful. Angramanu stamps the bodies of mortals. Interesting. Appreciate that super chat, though, Victor. I read it now, man. I didn't want to leave you hanging, bro. Wanted to make sure I read it. Yeah. Where was God after Noah's flood? Did God give him a test? Did God give him any texts to live by and share? Not as far as I can tell. Not in the biblical account. There's no text given. He talks to one guy about leaving his home, Abraham, and fleeing off into the desert, into a place where he says his descendants will inherit. And he waits till he's an old man to finally give him kids. You know, and his name was Abraham. No text given yet. Now, obviously, we know these stories were written with anachronistic ideas that laws were already taught to people. People were already believing these things. That's why Noah knows unclean from clean. Like, whoever wrote the story is kind of retrojecting these law codes that later are found in the tradition into an old antediluvian or pre-flood story. So I've heard all sorts of interesting things, but the scholarship says this, what I just said. I don't want to give you anything other than what the scholars say. That's important. Appreciate you, Victor, showing so much love. By the way, I need to catch up with you on WhatsApp. It's been a tough 4 or 5 months. I don't know if you've noticed that, Victor. But we should definitely chat sometime soon. I got you on the WhatsApp, and you've been a patron of Myth Vision for a while now, man. We've got to catch up and talk about maybe doing something fun together, man. I'd be interested to talk about some of these interesting things. Obviously, you're into this stuff. I am too. And I think it's interesting. We should talk about it. We should do more about it. I would read more of the books, but I really don't want to go on and on and on about it. I would just recommend you buy the books that I was pointing out in the video. If you haven't watched those spots and you're just tuning in, you're going to want to go back and do that. Let's turn to my buddy Paul from Inquisitive Bible Reader and listen to what he has to say about the traditions, because this guy is wicked smart, and I want you to subscribe to his YouTube channel. This is a shameless plug for my boy. He has the channel, The Inquisitive Bible Reader, the Genesis Flood. Let's watch this together. And if you have any questions, comments, feel free to super chat them. I'll pause what I'm doing and get to them as we are listening to what Paul has to say. Here we go.
The biblical flood story is the ideal passage for examining how Genesis was written. In this video, I explore its Mesopotamian background and how scholars think the story developed.
If you haven't seen this,
To understand,
you really do need to like check out this is very scholarly. Of course, I've done videos like this as well, but I want to shout out to my bro.
the story of the flood in Genesis, we need to begin in the desert.
Let me take off the subtitles so you can see. Want to change your caption settings? Just dismiss. Here we go.
In 1849, British archaeologists began excavating the ancient city of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq. There, they uncovered the palace library of Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, which contained a treasure trove of ancient tablets written in Akkadian. Some 25,000 of these tablets were sent back to the British Museum in London, where they sat in storage for years until a young Assyriologist named George Smith was hired to organize them. He spent a decade poring over the tablets and perfecting his knowledge of Akkadian before he stumbled on a truly remarkable tablet. Smith revealed his discovery during a highly publicized lecture for the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December of 1872. It was a tablet that told a story of a great flood that sounded in many details like the tale of Noah's flood we read about in Genesis. Smith called the newly discovered text the Chaldean account of the deluge. Today, we know it as the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This discovery would forever change biblical studies. It cast the primeval history of Genesis in a new light, not as a unique account of the world's beginnings, but as a text firmly rooted in the mythology and literary culture of the ancient Near East.
The Chaldean flood.
It's important to understand that there was a widespread literary tradition in Mesopotamia regarding creation, the flood, and other stories we find in Genesis. The Epic of Gilgamesh gave us our first evidence of that tradition, and it upended the study of the Bible. Noted Bible scholar John Van Cedars, in his influential book, Prologue to History, writes, "By the mid-first millennium BC, there was something like a classical Mesopotamian scheme for the primeval age, an Eastern antiquarian tradition. This was a learned literary tradition that maintained and transmitted the older classical works and that created new ones as the need or creative urge to do so arose. Gilgamesh itself was one of the most famous works of literature in the ancient world. One scholar has called it the most significant literary creation of the whole of ancient Mesopotamia. It was widely distributed and translated into several languages."
Hey, hold on. Do you see that name? Ladies and gentlemen, the Epic of Gilgamesh was the most significant literary creation of the whole of ancient Mesopotamia. Jeffrey H. Tigay. I hope I'm saying his name right. Forgive me if anyone knows this academic or if this scholar sees it. This is the very scholar that Wes Huff quotes in his video to point out that Gilgamesh is dependent upon Atrahasis. So the evolution of the Epic of Gilgamesh, I wonder if Jeffrey H. Tigay thinks that Genesis is borrowing from Gilgamesh. In fact, I would not be shocked if this would be exactly what apologists do. I don't know because I haven't read the book. I haven't looked at this material, but I want this scholar's name. I'm going to do a quick research here. Jeffrey H. Tigay, and ask, does Dr. Jeffrey H. Tigay argue anywhere that the Gilgamesh Epic inspired Genesis to write their story, or that Genesis, because it's AI, I want to make sure it understands me, borrowed from Gilgamesh? Question mark. Here we go. Let's see what it says. Short answer, Jeffrey H. Tigay absolutely argues that the Mesopotamian flood traditions, especially as preserved in Gilgamesh, precede and influence the biblical flood story, but he does not say Genesis directly borrowed from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Instead, he argues something more precise and academically careful. Tigay argues that Genesis and Gilgamesh both draw from an older Mesopotamian flood tradition rooted in Atrahasis and earlier Sumerian version Ziud-Sudra. So hold on. The guy that Wes Huff quoted doesn't want to say Genesis borrowed directly from Gilgamesh, but that he borrowed from Atrahasis and Sumerian versions of Ziud-Sudra. Like, does Wes quote people that he doesn't agree with? Or does Wes Huff agree? Does Wes Huff agree with this scholar's views of Genesis borrowing from these older myths? Or is he just using him for quote mining him to just like prove his one point about that one thing. I hear this all the time when people quote Bart Ehrman or they quote, whoever to prove their one point and disagree with everything else that academic has to say about the argument.
And it survives in numerous copies from the 1st and 2nd millennia BCE, as well as through references in other ancient works. In Tablet 11, Gilgamesh meets a man named Utnapishtim who recounts the story of how he, together with his wife, survived a great flood that sounds quite a lot like the Genesis flood. Many elements of the Gilgamesh flood narrative will be familiar to anyone raised with the biblical story of Noah and the Ark. When the gods decide to destroy mankind with a deluge, Ea, the god of Utnapishtim, comes to him and instructs him to build an ark with which he is to save himself and specimens of every living creature. Ea gives him precise dimensions for this ship and instructs him to include a roof. Just as Noah did in response to Yahweh, Utnapishtim obeys all that Ea commands. Over a period of 7 days, he builds the ark with the help of workmen from the city. He covers the ark with pitch. On the last day, he boards the ark with his family and the animals. Then the storm comes with a terrible downpour and a deluge that kills all mankind. After 7 days, the storm abates, and the ark comes to rest in a mountain, Mount Nemush. After 7 more days, Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, and then a raven to look for a landing place. When the raven does not return, Utnapishtim leaves the ark and, like Noah, offers a sacrifice. The gods smell the sacrifice and are pleased by its odor. Perhaps the biggest difference between Genesis and Gilgamesh is the ending, in which Ea makes Utnapishtim and his wife immortal and has them dwell far off at the source of the rivers, understood to mean the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We hear echoes of this, however, in Genesis 2, where Yahweh places Adam in Eden at the source of 4 rivers, including the Tigris and Euphrates. This flood story did not, in fact, originate with the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
It was borrowed in its entirety from an older work called Atrahasis. Variations of this story were incorporated into other ancient literature as well, including the Babyloniaca of Berossus and the Deucalion flood story of the Greeks. So that should give
it's
you
so
a very
funny to watch how we pronounce Babylon. That he says like Atrahasis, I'm like Atrahasis, and then like Babyloniaca, and I'm like Babyloniaca, I might say, or something. I don't know.
Basic idea of the Eastern antiquarian tradition that the flood story and other early portions of Genesis fit into. We're not quite done with Gilgamesh yet, though, because the way in which Gilgamesh was written is incredibly important for understanding Genesis. Without that context, you're missing a valuable tool that can give you a deeper understanding of the text. The Gilgamesh Epic began as a collection of Sumerian tales written around the 21st century BCE. In its earliest form, Gilgamesh was essentially a rewrite of 4 of those Sumerian tales. Centuries later, the flood story from another literary work, the previously mentioned Atrahasis, was incorporated. A prologue and additional story elements were also added. Further minor changes to the final version were made during the process of copying and transmitting the text. At each stage of development, the scribes
I love
felt
that he's going over from left to right to show like you've got ancient Gilgamesh stories. I mean, we're talking before 2000 years BCE, way before. The flood narrative gets developed in Atrahasis, or Atrahasis as he's pronouncing it, and that introduces itself into later Gilgamesh legends of a flood myth that you see.
To adapt traditional material in accordance with their theology and to harmonize the sources they were combining. The further this process went, the more the authors were restricted by existing tradition. Geoffrey Teagate, in his definitive book on the Gilgamesh Epic, explains that freedom of revision steadily decreased during the history of the epic's development. The early Babylonian version was a free paraphrase of its Sumerian sources, but later versions were much more restricted. In a highly regarded work of scholarship titled Reading the Fractures of Genesis, Professor David M. Carr of Union Theological Seminary explains that ancient literature differed from modern in very significant ways. You cannot really understand an ancient text like Genesis without being aware of these differences. Singularity of authorship. Unlike modern texts, ancient literary works often circulated anonymously. There were no authorship rights. Genesis contains no authorship claims, for example, despite its later association with Moses. Textual solidity. Whereas modern texts are protected...
This was my point. People were complaining about the title, and I'm like, Did that on purpose. Don't get mad at me. That was the point. Click on it. It's not stolen. Yeah, I know. But it's clearly borrowing from the tradition. There's no doubt.
By copyright and published in a fixed form, ancient texts like Gilgamesh or Genesis often seem to have achieved textual solidity only after they had been in circulation for a long time. The text only became fixed once it had attained authoritative status within the communities transmitting them.
Final draft.
The genre of fiction. Modern readers expect a story to either be a work of fiction or history. Fiction is entirely the creation of the author and makes no claim to report past events. Works of history are written by a historian who builds a brand new narrative after having critically evaluated her or his sources. Ancient narrative texts like Genesis and Gilgamesh wanted to make true claims about the past, so they lacked the freedom of a modern fiction writer. But they also lacked the freedom of a history writer because they trusted the traditions that had been handed down to them and preferred to build on those.
What do you think so far, friends? What do you think so far? I'm going to keep playing it, but I want to know. Press 1 if you're digging what he's saying. Press 2. Yeah, 2 if you're not. I want to hear. I want to hear from you. 1 if you're loving it. 2, nah, not into it. I want to hear from you. Let's see some of those votes. Same. Heck yeah. All right. So we got a lot of ones up in this house. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. 42. Yeah. 1. There we go. Okay, Warlight's 0. You have to be a contrarian. You, Jim, have to be a contrarian. 1. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but listen. You have to listen because I'm doing this. I hate doing this. I should have called Paul and be like, hey, dude, do you mind if I play the video? You have to subscribe to him right now. I ask everybody right now. I'm not going to play the video until I get everybody who's watching. Please take the time real quick. I'm putting the link to this video in here. Subscribe to his YouTube channel right now. I put the video here. I'm sure Paul won't mind as long as I'm shamelessly plugging him to get you guys to go check out his channel because he's my buddy. And I really do want more people to pay attention to good scholarship and good content creators who are trying to, help people see what's going on with the best that's out there. We're going to keep going. So there's the YouTube channel. Please, everybody. He's got 11.8K. I want, hopefully, by the end of this video, in a day or two from now, we should be over 12,000 subscribers on his channel. He should see a boost. I promise you. If we can do that for him, he'll be very grateful for us even playing this and allowing him growth. I do not like doing this without allowing you independently to watching his videos because I'm just one person. And let's say a lot of people are watching this through my video instead of watching it directly on his channel. But if I'm gaining him, followers to check out his brilliant work, I think he'll be appreciative of it. I know Paul enough to think that he would not have a problem with this. This is to all credit to him for what he's done. While you're doing that, I'm going to check out this super chat. Can't leave my anti-contrarian hanging. Thank you again, my friend, for the super chat. I really, really appreciate it. Do you think the instructions of Shurupak have any influence on the Old Testament laws? The instructions appear to be the oldest law codes found. I do not know about whether or not the Shurupak instructions. I know that Hammurabi's code, there are vassal treaties and all sorts of interesting things that Hammurabi's codes seem to have influence. But Shurupak, I've never heard of whether or not, or haven't looked into that. Has Shurupak, how'd you frame this? It makes me curious. Instructions of Shurupak. Has the instructions of Shurupak influence Bible codes. Let's just say that. Just Bible law codes. Let's see. Yes, many scholars argue that the Sumerian instructions of Shuruppak influenced later Mesopotamian wisdom and law traditions, which in turn shaped the legal and ethical material in the Hebrew Bible. But the influence is not direct. It is traditional and cultural, transmitted through the broader Mesopotamian scribal world. But that's just ChatGPT, and I'm sure that they could probably pull up some scholars. Samuel Noah Kramer, who has made this, the premier Sumeriologist, argued that Shuruppak is the ancestor of later Mesopotamian ethical traditions, and that these traditions significantly influenced biblical wisdom literature. History Begins at Sumer and the Sumerians. Those are books that Samuel Noah Kramer wrote. And then Thorkild Jacobson, another major Assyriologist, who argued that Shurupak's instructions helped shape the moral fabric of Mesopotamia, fabric that Israel inherited during and after the Babylonian exile. Books, The Harps That Once, and ... Treasures of Darkness. By the way, someone might go, you're looking on ChatGPT. Whenever you ever use ChatGPT, always go and find the source and check, because it hallucinates stuff. But that doesn't mean it isn't useful for quick references like this to be able to find academics who say this. And even then, though, you can't trust ChatGPT to always assess that that's what the scholars themselves actually hold. You got to go read the book. You got to get the material. W.G. Lambert, good name, if I say so myself. My last name. Lambert, a giant in A&E studies, emphasizes that Shuruppak is foundational for the entire Near Eastern wisdom tradition. Books, Babylonian wisdom literature, and a catalog of the texts in the museum. There's many others. Mark S. Smith argues that early Israelite literature was thoroughly embedded in and shared Canaanite Mesopotamian scribal culture, but it doesn't mention the Shuruppak stuff. So, yeah, there's your answer. I would say there's probably indirect influence, depending on how old and how common it would be that Sumerian literature actually directly inspired. Okay, someone subscribed. Thank you. Just subbed, X Music. Thank you. I subbed to him. Just subscribed. Awesome. More. Just subbed. Another sub. I subscribed to the Inquisitive Bible Reader. Thank you so much. You guys have no clue. He's going to have a good day. He'll wake up happy to see more people going and subbing. Subbed and liked. Yes. I promise you, Paul will be so thankful for your viewership and to go and show comments. In fact, on this video, if you'd be so kind when we're done, if you want, go over there and say Myth Vision sent me or whatever. Let him know that you're there and he'll be super thankful. So let us continue with what Paul Davidson has made here, and I will pause periodically.
In his book, Carr takes a fresh look at the widespread view of scholars that Genesis, like Gilgamesh and other ancient texts, was composed over time by different authors. Assuming that this is true, he asks what indicators we might look for in biblical texts that might clue us in, as he puts it, to the history of their formation. It turns out there are a number of ways in which the text of the flood story reveals clues to its transmission history. Features like doublets, contradictions, breaks in narrative structure, and shifts in terminology and ideology can indicate the scenes where multiple sources have been combined.
Right.
Of course, it is perfectly possible for a single author to deliberately introduce such features for literary effect. However, if, for example, the appearance of doublets in the Genesis flood story correlates perfectly with shifts in terminology and contradictions in the text, the use of multiple sources is highly probable, especially given what we know about the formation of Gilgamesh and other ancient texts. So what sources should we be looking for in Genesis? It might seem like putting the cart before the horse, but before we examine the flood story for these clues, we need to be aware of the near-universal consensus on certain sources found in the Pentateuch. For the first potential source,
I love that he's going, oh
from
man, I'm so glad he's taking the time, because this is something that David Carr does, and I showed you his book, just a brief section of it. So you have to go get David Carr's book if you can afford it. But David Carr breaks down this point of within the biblical tradition and all sorts of technical details that you need to know to really wrap your head around what's going on in the Bible before even dealing with outside sources. This is important.
He writes, the identification of priestly material, or P, in the Pentateuch remains one of the better established results of biblical transmission historical research.
Yeah.
Numerous theories about the development of the Pentateuch abound. However, it is almost universally recognized that throughout the Pentateuch, there are numerous passages with a special interest.
By the way, can I just say you guys rock? Like, honestly, everyone, for just being such a great community of people who are actually trying to get behind good stuff like this. You rock. If someone hasn't told you that today, I am.
In the establishment of the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the revelation of the name Yahweh to Israel. These passages have distinctive vocabulary, ideological concerns, and a calendar system that sets them apart from the rest of the text. This layer of the text is called the priestly source, or the P source. It sets all the important events in Israel's history up to the conquest of the Promised Land as the fulfillment of a plan ordained by Yahweh at creation. A second source we should be watching out for is referred to as the Yahwist source, or J source, because Yahwist begins with a J in German. Bible scholars have recognized since the 18th century that the various passages in the Pentateuch in which Israel's deity is called Yahweh are distinct from those in which he is called Elohim. The exact nature of this source document, including its very existence, is disputed by scholars, and Carr prefers simply to call this source non-P in Genesis. I'll stick with the more typical label of J in this video.
So just that's such a debate in and of itself, that P and non-P is what most of the scholars I bump into like to do, instead of trying to differentiate between J, E, D, and P. It's such a mess, but P and non-P seems to be the safest path forward a lot of these scholars like to take that I talk to. Here we go.
Now that we understand how ancient texts were formed and have an idea of what sources might be found in Genesis, let's look at the text of the flood story itself. The reason for the flood is first described in Genesis 6 verses 5 to 7. Yahweh saw that the evil of man was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made man on the ground, and it grieved him to his heart. So Yahweh said, I will blot out from the ground the men I have created, for I am sorry that I have made them.
That's a totally, absolutely omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent deity. He's sorry that he made man. Oh, man. What do you do?
In verses 11 to 13, we are again told what the reason for the flood is. Now the earth was corrupt in Elohim's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And Elohim saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And Elohim said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to corrupt them along with the earth. Of course, it's possible for a single author to have written both passages, but if we can find shifts in wording, style, and ideology that correspond to this doublet, then the likelihood of two sources is much higher. In the first passage, the deity is called Yahweh. The reason for the flood is the evil of man. The author enjoys wordplay and uses the word ground, ha-adama, because of its similarity to the word for man, ha-adam. And Yahweh is highly anthropomorphized. He expresses sorrow and regret.
Yeah, very
now, in
human
the second
God.
passage, the deity is instead called Elohim. The reasons for the flood are corruption and violence. The author likes using the phrase all flesh and the word earth. Elohim speaks more formally and shows no emotion. Since the first passage calls the deity Yahweh, let's tentatively assign it to the J source. The other we will tentatively assign to the P source. In Genesis 6:8, following the J source's reason for the flood, we are introduced to Noah. But Noah found favor in the sight of Yahweh. Then in the next verse, we are introduced to Noah a second time. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with the Elohim, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Interesting.
The main distinguishing feature in this doublet is the name of the deity, Yahweh in one case, Elohim in the other. Additionally, the names of Noah's 3 sons are found only in passages associated with the priestly source. God tells Noah twice about the flood he is going to send. The first time is in 7:4. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. The second time is in verses 17 and 18. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, to corrupt from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. The vocabulary distinctions seen earlier are repeated here, and there are some new ones that will soon show a pattern. One is that the J source uses a relative chronology based on the numbers 7 and 40. Another is that the flood is caused by rain in the J source, but comes from elsewhere later on in the P source. A third is the reference to covenants, which occur only in the P source and are an important element of P's view of history. Yahweh gives Noah instructions for surviving the flood in chapter 7 verses 1 to 3. Then Yahweh said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you all clean animals 7 by 7, the husband and his wife, and a pair of the animals that are unclean, the husband and his wife, to keep their seed alive on the face of the ground. However, in a parallel section from the previous chapter, Elohim has already given an alternate version of these instructions to Noah. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kind, and of the animals according to their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive. Again, there are important differences to notice. The J source is careful to distinguish between clean and unclean animals. In that author's mind, it is perfectly natural that the Jewish sacrifice and dietary laws already existed in Noah's day. The P source does not mention clean or unclean animals because the Levitical laws do not exist until the time of Moses in his narrative. Another difference is that the J source refers to animal pairs as the husband and his wife. The P source uses the phrase male and female and enumerates animals with the phrase according to their kind. Noah's entry into the ark is one of the most obvious.
I was just mentioning the whole clean and unclean thing earlier too. It's interesting to see how P source knows that Moses is coming later with the laws, so he avoids giving too much away because he's constructing this material. Interesting.
Doublets in the story. In chapter 7 verses 5 and 7 we read, And Noah did all that Yahweh had commanded him. And Noah with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Then, a little further on in chapter 7 verse 13, Noah again goes into the ark with his family and the animals, and we are again told in verse 22 that Noah did all that Elohim commanded him.
So he went into the ark twice.
As it now stands, Noah goes into the ark twice, once at Yahweh's command, and again at Elohim's command.
Very interesting. Parsing the part.
For the coming of the flood
forces.
And the swelling of the waters, we again have 2 parallel accounts. The combined text has a confusing timeline that is impossible to reconcile, but when we separate out the parallel accounts, we can clearly see 2 sources at work. Chapter 7 verses 10, 12, and 17 give us the J version. And after 7 days the waters of the flood came on the earth. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. Verses 11, 18 to 20, and 24 give an alternate cause of the flood and a contradictory timeline. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. Again, we see the J source's preference for durations of 7 and 40 days, while the P source uses an absolute chronology. The flood waters increase for 40 days in J, and 150 days in P. The flood comes from rain in J, and the 40-day duration is important to the logic of the story. A short period of rain, after all, would not be enough to flood the entire world and kill all mankind. This is important for another reason that we shall see further on. In P, the floodwaters come not from the rain, but from the deep, an ocean thought to have existed below the earth, and from heaven, which was thought to contain water due to its blue color. This is an example of P's more sophisticated Mesopotamian cosmology. The end of the flood is yet another doublet. In chapter 8, verses 2b to 3, we are told that the rains stop and the waters start to recede. In 6 to 7, Noah waits 40 days before sending out a raven to search for dry land. However, in 8 verses 1 to 2a, it is the closing of the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven.
Real quick, just to pause this, because there's so much good material at the end of the flood, what he's doing. I just find it really interesting when I see people like this pop into my chat. I'll notice sometimes from the corner of my eye when I'm not like talking about something, I notice people like this who seem to like not know anything about anything. You know what I'm saying? Like they just don't know about much of anything, it seems. And they're making like it's a mockery of us. And it's like, please, just don't embarrass yourself anymore. You know what I'm saying? Just quit embarrassing yourself. It's really silly. Anyway, I just thought I'd give you guys a laugh because I chuckle when there's people who enter the chat who say stuff like, we found something in 1872 and we've known this book before that. Therefore, this thing we found in 1872 doesn't predate that. As if archaeologists can't discover stuff that's like, I don't know, Göbekli Tepe, like 11,000 years old. But because we discovered it, let's say 80 years ago, it can't be older than the thing we already know about. It's like the logic is not there. There's no critical thinking. It's really weird.
Accompanied by a wind sent by Elohim that caused the waters to dry up. According to verse 3, it takes 150 days, rather than 40, for the waters to abate, enough for the ark to come to rest on dry land. Now, regarding the birds, in the final version of the story, Noah sends out a raven and then a dove 3 times. Most scholars assign the raven and the doves to the J source because of the 7-day intervals for the dove, but there are actually good reasons to assign the doves to the P source. That's something I'd like to explain further in another video. The story seems to have 2 separate conclusions in which the deity decides never to flood the world again. In 820 and following, Noah builds an altar to Yahweh and sacrifices every clean animal and bird. Yahweh enjoys the odor and resolves never to destroy the earth again. The chapter ends with a poem expressing Yahweh's intent never to destroy all life again, bringing closure to the story. However, in chapter 9, we get a rather different ending. Elohim blesses Noah and his sons, and then he establishes a covenant with Noah and the animals, promising to never again flood the world. Elohim also sets his bow in the sky to remind himself of this promise. Covenants that tie together the overarching story of Israel are a typical concern of the priestly author. Also note that the reasons given for the deity's promise differ in the 2 endings. In the J version, the smell of the sacrifice mollifies Yahweh. In the P version, it is the covenant.
I think it's really important to emphasize what he just said about the pleasing odor, that we see that in all the earlier stories, the flood stories. The gods are angry, Enlil's pissed, and he finds this guy who survives. He's angry. He comes over and then there's a sacrifice and he smells it. And then he's like, oh, so he rewards this guy with immortality, but he's like, he's hungry and he smells the food. And I don't know about you, but if you've been in a long day at work and then you come home and you smell that food cooking in the kitchen and you're like, oh, and it's just so like, it'll change your mood. The fact that God's mood changes because Noah sacrifices to him and it's sweet aroma, some barbecue, if you will. And he's like, oh, snap. I'm never going to do that again. I'm sorry, Noah and humans. I'm never going to do that again. Like, clearly that continues that older tradition, but it also is problematic for those who philosophically put God in these omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipresent, all of these kinds of categories. And they'll just go, oh, that's just anthropomorphic language, but it's metaphorical. It's like, no, dude, no. Their God is depicted this way because that's how they understand their God to actually behave and be. And it's also how all the other gods that also walk and talk and look and act that way as well do. It's the same thing.
Hopefully, this very brief look at some of the repetition in the flood story should help you understand why practically all scholars believe it is the work of 2 sources combined together. In his book, Carr addresses a key question. Were these doublets written to complement each other, Or did they originate as separate sources that were only later brought together? The existence of contradictions and major conceptual differences between the doublets implies the latter. One of the most significant examples is the clear difference in how the P and J passages regard sacrifices. The passages we may tentatively label as non-P or J portray Noah as an observant Jew who knows the difference between clean and unclean animals. It specifies that 7 pairs of all the clean animals and birds are to be brought on board the ark, and it shows Noah sacrificing them to Yahweh after the flood. The passages assigned to P make no mention of sacrifices or of clean and unclean animals. If they were part of a longer narrative in which Yahweh's laws on cleanliness and sacrifices were unknown until the time of Moses, then we have an explanation for why the P version differs in this way. This tension between the two sources gives rise to another obvious contradiction, as Noah is commanded by Yahweh to take 7 pairs of all clean animals onto the ark in chapter 7, verse 2, but when he fulfills the command of Elohim in verse 9, he only takes 2 of every animal. Another example concerns the dates given within the story. As mentioned before, the chronology of the flood is highly confusing. There are both contradictions between our two sources and differences in how they date events.
So that's the other problem. Someone asked me when was the flood? According to the genealogy between the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text, it gives 3 completely different dates. That's not counting that within the material we have alternative sequences of when these things and how long they lasted. My goodness, there's more dates of when the flood would have happened. Is it 150 days or is it 40 days? And there's just so many contradictions within the source material itself, let alone the manuscript traditions. It's complex.
The J source, the 40-day flood begins 7 days after Noah's entry into the ark. In the P strand, the flood begins on the very same day that Noah enters the ark. It is hard to pick up on this contradiction without separating the text into its sources, because the J notice that the flood lasted 40 days has been inserted before P's statement about that very same day, obscuring which day the statement refers to. The duration of the flood differs significantly as well. In the J source, the rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. In the P source, the waters swell for 150 days and then abate for 150 days. Overall, the J source uses relative dates based on 7-day and 40-day intervals. The P source, however, uses an absolute calendar-based dating system. The flood starts on the 17th day of the 2nd month in the 600th year of Noah's life. Picking apart this chronological system is quite interesting, but I'll leave that for another video. Belgian scholar and Pentateuch expert Jean-Louis Scott stresses the importance of recognizing and accepting these disagreements in the flood story. He writes, "The present account of the flood is like a cantata sung by 2 or more voices. The universe could only be destroyed once, and it was therefore difficult to relate the event 2 times. The message, nevertheless, is polyphonic. A reading that would attempt to eliminate the different voices in order to defend the unity of the composition would not only risk abolishing certain facts in the texts, but also leaving an important part of the message out."
Interesting.
This analysis so far strongly suggests that the Genesis flood story is the result of interweaving 2 different strands from 2 sources, P and J, that appear to have existed as independent documents in some form. Nevertheless, there is an obvious close relationship between P and J. As Carr notes, the 2 strands are extremely similar to each other, matching episode to episode, even sub-episode to sub-episode, and comment to comment. They share some rare vocabulary and are more similar to each other than to the non-biblical flood stories, such as Gilgamesh, that influenced them. In other words, it is likely either that P is dependent on J, meaning that it copied and altered J's version of the flood story, or that the reverse is true and J is dependent on P. Are there any clues in the text as to which way the dependence goes? Carr finds 2 reasons that P seems to be dependent on J in the flood story. One is that P seems to consistently expand upon the framework of J. For example, it expands the description of the rising waters, it elaborates on Elohim's decision to end the flood, and it turns J's simple promise at the end of the flood into a lengthy covenant. The other reason is that P's chronology seems to imitate J, albeit with changes, even though P's other changes render much of the chronology unimportant.
So P seems later. Okay, connecting P and J. Conclusion. Let's go to his conclusion real quick, and then I want to play an old video that I did that was I believe this one will be the one that was crafted by Joshua Bowen. I'll double check, but let's go, keep going. I'm gonna look for
1.
it.
The writing of history-like texts was a process that took place over time and often involved the combining of multiple sources into a new literary creation. 2. The fractures in a biblical text, doublets, narrative contradictions, terminology shifts, and so on, provide clues to its formation. 3. The Genesis flood story appears to be a combination of two primary sources that most scholars refer to as the priestly source and the Yahwist or non-priestly source. 4. The Yahwist source was probably earlier, and it closely follows the plot of the flood story found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. 5. The priestly document was probably based on the Yahwist source and was written to replace it. 6. What we ended up...
Okay. We get it. P seems to be dependent on J, and this also goes back to the Gilgamesh stuff. We're about to have to watch one of my documentaries that I did from way back. Many of you may have actually seen this video before. If you haven't subscribed to Paul, please do. At this moment, I want to remind you to subscribe to Inquisitive Bible Reader. He will be very thankful. I promise you, if you wanted to make someone's day, he will wake up probably smiling, going, wow, okay, people care about the hard work that I did here, and I've got new followers that are checking out my YouTube videos. All right, we're going to get to this in just a moment, but before we do, someone just got saved. Sylvia Bowen, thank you so much for becoming a member of the YouTube channel here. It means the world. I really, really appreciate it. We are trying to grow, keep doing this thing. We're going to be doing lives a lot, and you're going to have a special symbol next to your name every single time you're in a live with us. So you're special. You are chosen by the gods. We really, really appreciate that. So if you're considering it and you like what we do as a content, educating people, super chats are a way to help support. Becoming a member is a way to support. Buying courses are ways. Those are financial ways. There's free ways as well. Like, share, comment, subscribe. All of those are free ways if you can't afford the other way. But we could definitely use all the help we can get. I really appreciate that, Sylvia. I'm going to keep you up while we start the video that Joshua Bowen helped me to make. He wrote the script, and this comes from his work, of course. So I promote his videos, or his videos, his book. Make sure you go, and this is a pretty popular video. We had 1,302,273 views in 2023. So it's been about 2 to 3 years now, and it's got quite a few views, pretty big. So if you haven't watched it, this will be your first time. If not, let's have some fun together, because this is fun. This is the true origins of Genesis creation will blow your mind. Let's check it out. Did Genesis chapters 1 through 3 borrow elements from much earlier Mesopotamian mythological stories? Brace yourself as we explore the linguistic, lexical, and thematic connections between these ancient myths, such as the Enuma Elish and the Genesis narrative. But let's not overlook the implications of such borrowing. Shouldn't this compel open-minded individuals to question the literal truth of these stories? Before we proceed, let's address some crucial points. The Hebrew language, as recorded in the earliest texts, dates back perhaps to the 10th century BCE, while the Mesopotamian myths, etched onto clay tablets, are often over 1,000 years older. Contrary to mistaken assumptions, the Hebrew Bible's creation and flood story contains Akkadian cognates from that much earlier language. That's the bitumen that I was talking about. The other way around. And other things. It is essential to clarify this misconception and correct any misguided notions that suggest the other myths drew inspiration from the Bible. This factual inaccuracy needs to be rectified Just before we continue, of course, this is my point. There are people today who actually try to argue the Bible's older or the story in the Bible predates this way older material. That's the crazy, absolute apologetic world you have to go to try and like get away from, well, the Bible didn't borrow from them. They borrowed from the Bible. And it's like, I need to address how much older the Sumerian material really is. Like, people don't get that the oldest physical copies we have of any Bible literally is Dead Sea Scroll material. Like, that's the oldest Bible that we have. There's debate over little minor stuff about 5th century material, things like that. But like, you're not talking ancient tablets, right? So I need to just nip that in the butt, because so many people try to make that argument. The Bible contains the true story that was given him by Abraham, and they borrowed from Abraham. It's never ends. Continue. Those who attempt to use Mesopotamian myths as evidence support. We got a super duper in the house. Victor, thank you so much for the super chat. CTH 346.9 is an even older Hurrian Hittite flood myth. Huh? It won't let me copy and paste that. I'd have to type all of that out. Even older Hurrian. Let me do this. Let me see if I can't get. Can you write me on WhatsApp, Victor? And I'll check out what you're talking about. If that link is live. It won't let me copy and paste. Let me see if I can't get it somehow through the YouTube side, because I'm in a whole different software. I want to see what you're talking about. Let me refresh this screen. Bear with. We're getting there. Okay. Think you got it. Okay, there we are. Okay, let me share this with everybody real quick. We're going to pause the video. We're coming back. Don't worry. We're coming back. But we need to show this, because you super chatted me. Okay. Zooming in so everybody could see. You sent 346.9, so 346.9, and you say is an even older Hurrian Hittite flood myth. So him, you could tell where the broken spots are with the ... I imagine that's broken. This is in a whole other language. Let me see if I can't translate into English. It's in German. So yeah. Heaven, the weather god, the Danae in the middle of water, approach the sky, cover the terrible in heaven, because what it creates the sea. How old is this? What it creates the sea. Another placed the bronze spade in your hand at the breast of the earth. The floods, the mountains were formed on stones. Floods covered the land. They rose up the floods and reaches up to the sun god and moon god and reached up to the stars of heaven or of the sky. Kumarbi began to speak the words to the gods which deity did we not recognize? We knew it, the sea, him to the hearth of the earth. Pay tribute to the sea. Gemstone, lapis lazuli, parasha stone, silver, gold should lie in the water. We throw them into the water. When the sea, the tribute stand, none in the midst of the gods. Come, Ishtar, queen of Nineveh. You wrote you, me here, but you let her live, and me, myself. That's interesting. Is that like you let her live? Is that a callback to the death and resurrection of, Inanna, Ishtar, her dying and rising? Because I know she does that. Yeah. How old is this? Have you looked at the dates on this, Victor? I used my Mac to translate it. So if you find the date, let everyone know in the chat right now, just so we know how old this Hittite flood story is. And we're going to get back to the story or the video. Thank you again, Victor, of course, for the super chat. You're keeping the lights on so that we at MythVision don't have a deluge. And I appreciate that. All right, here, let's get back to the true origins of Genesis. And I'll be looking out for your comment about the dating Don't know the age, but the Hurrian culture is older. Well, before we move forward, is the Hurrian culture flood myths older than the Atrahasis? Let's just say that. Atrahasis flood story. Let's just see. And let's see. No, the Hurrian flood stories are not older than the Atrahasis flood myth. Of course, it's going to be older than the Bible, but the Atrahasis tradition is older, earlier tested, and clearly the ancestor of both the Babylonian and the later Hurrian Hittite versions. Atrahasis is estimated around 1750 BCE, and earlier fragments go back even further in the Old Akkadian period, maybe 2200 to 2000 BCE. Ziutsudra, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh. Hurrian flood stories appear later, usually preserved through Hittite translations dating from around 1500 to 1300 BCE. Still older than the Bible, but that's when they date the Hurrian stuff. So it's younger than Atrahasis, but it's obviously older than Genesis in the Bible. There we have it. That's what it's saying. So fact check me, see if that's right. Let's continue the movie. And interrupt anytime with a super chat. We thank you. Supporting the historical truth of the biblical narrative are quite frankly missing the boat, or rather, missing Noah's Ark altogether. Can we genuinely believe that Utnapishtim and his wife are walking among us, bestowed with immortality by the gods? Do we truly entertain the notion that Enlil annihilated humanity simply for being too noisy? Or that Marduk fashioned the cosmos from the remains of the sea goddess Tiamat? It's a resounding no to both, of course. As someone who was a Bible fundamentalist, I understand the profound impact of blindly following ill-informed teachings. Today, reading these older texts and understanding their original context has given me a richer understanding of the meaning of these stories. I actually love these stories for what they are, and it is my goal for others to enjoy reading them in their actual historical context, and not as if they dropped out of heaven. However, as we explore the intricate web of connections between these polytheistic Mesopotamian myths and the later monotheistic Hebrew Bible, it becomes evident that the Genesis creation and flood accounts were crafted using popular mythological motifs of the time. This realization raises critical questions about the historical plausibility and the nature of scriptural inspiration. Yes, the Bible is undoubtedly inspired, but by these pre-existing Mesopotamian myths that served as a foundation for its storytelling. Join us on this intellectual journey, my friends. Scholars agree that most of the primeval history borrows directly or indirectly from Mesopotamian mythology, and Genesis 1 is no exception. While there is debate as to whether such borrowing was conscious and polemical, or simply due to the overall influence of the myth in the ancient Near East, the consensus is that the opening chapter of Genesis almost certainly owes its existence to the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is an Akkadian story dating back to the mid to late 2nd millennium BCE that tells of the god Marduk and his rise to power over the other gods. Yep. The story begins before heaven and earth had been created. The two water deities, Apsu and Tiamat, brought forth the gods. Shortly after their creation, however, they became noisy and bothersome to the god,
Apsu, who decided to kill them. Ea, however, in his wisdom, was able to thwart Apsu's plans and fought back.
Ea was aware of all, discerned their stratagem. He fashioned it, he established it, a master plan. He made it artful, his superb magic spell. He recited it and brought him to rest in the waters. He put him in deep slumber. He was fast asleep. He made Apsu sleep. He tied up Apsu. He killed him.
Having killed Apsu, Ea and his spouse Damkina take over his home and give birth to mighty Marduk.
His body was magnificent, fiery his glance. He was a hero at birth. He was a mighty one from the beginning.
Anu creates 4 winds for Marduk to play with, and with them he disturbed Tiamat.
He caused a wave and it roiled Tiamat. Tiamat was roiled, churning day and night. The gods, finding no rest, bore the brunt of each wind.
By the way, that's Joshua Bowen's voice that I tweaked. I gave it like a deeper, like a story, like ancient Phil kind of tone.
Tiamat plots to kill Marduk and the other gods.
Mother Hubor, Tiamat, who can form everything, added countless invincible weapons, gave birth to monster serpents pointed of fang. With merciless incisors, she filled their bodies with venom for blood. Fierce dragons she clad with glories, causing them to bear auras like gods, saying, "Whoever sees them shall collapse from weakness. Wherever their bodies make onslaught, they shall not turn back."
Oh, we got a super duper. Thank you so much, Victor, for the super chat. You rock, man. Josephus mentions tourism at a site in Armenia where the Ark landed. Antiquities 135. I'm guessing he means the Durunipar site. Durunipar site. Interesting. I did not know that, but it wouldn't shock me if they were doing like, they have within a few centuries of Christianity, obviously, there's this constant tourism of come check out this church. We got the femur bone of Peter. This is the cave that Jesus was buried in, and there's like 8 of them or whatever. Durunipar site. I don't know. Let me look that up. So Antiquities 135. Let me grab my antiquities here. Bear with. So we're opening up together. Jewish war, not in Jewish war. Antiquities is huge. And this is in book 135. So Antiquities book 135. Josephus here. Let me come back to me full screen for a second here. So Josephus here takes notice that these ancient genealogies were first set down by those that then lived, and from them were transmitted down to posterity, which I suppose to be the true account of that matter, for there is no reason to imagine that men were not taught to read and write soon after they were taught to speak, and perhaps all by the Messiah himself, who under the Father was the creator or governor of mankind, and who frequently in those days appeared to them. This is book 135, chapter 3, verse 5. I didn't hear about the... Am I somewhere wrong here? Hold on, 3.5. Let me see if this is it, maybe. Oh, okay. So there's a different spot. That was chapter 3. Section 5. When God gave the signal and it began to rain, the water poured down 40 entire days until it became 15 cubits higher than the earth, which was the reason why there was no greater number preserved, since they had no place to fly to. When the rain ceased, the water did but just begin to abate after 150 days. That is on the 17th day of the 7th month. It then ceasing to subside for a little while. After this, the ark rested on the top of a certain mountain in Armenia. which when Noah understood, he opened it, and seeing a small piece of land about it, he continued quiet and conceived some cheerful hopes of deliverance. But a few days afterward, when the water was decreased to a greater degree, he sent out a raven as desirous to learn whether any other part of the earth were left dry by the water. Okay, so yeah, Armenia, but I don't know about the Darunapar site. So let me see if there's like a online Darunapar ARC site. Darunapar site. This is the famous. I see what you're looking at here. Okay, let me share screen, show you what we're looking at. So the Darunapar site, we've all seen the famous Ark of the Noah's Ark here, right? Let's see if I can zoom in. Won't let me zoom in. Let me go back. So this is the structure claimed to be the Noah's Ark near the Mount Ararat or Judi in Agri, Turkey. He doesn't say that they did tourism there or anything in Josephus' day, but why did he choose that area? Maybe the idea was there were some people who thought the geography reflected something like that. It wouldn't shock me one bit. It would not shock me. Yeah, I want to make sure. Is that the mountain that looks like an arc? Yep. Let me close this here. Okay. Yeah, according to Krakenford, the flood myth originated in that region where the Hurrians lived. Interesting. Mount Ararat, of course, So that's the bigger mountain in the north. It's further up north, Mount Ararat. Yeah, I don't know what to make of it because I didn't want to get into this, but I'll do it anyways. It might be worth mentioning, and I don't know how true this is. If you haven't got this book, get it. It's fun. If these scholars are even right at all about some of what they're saying, it's fascinating. And on the front cover, there is a sill, what they argue is the earliest depiction of Adam and Eve. On sills, right? Like a older Canaanite tradition that they think is Adam and Eve. And they titled the book Adam, Eve, and the Devil, A New Beginning, right? In this book, the authors develop an intriguing theory about the Canaanite origin of the biblical traditions concerning the origin of the cosmos and the creation of humankind. Adam, Eve, and the Devil tells a new story about human beings and at the same time proposes a fresh start for biblical research into primordial traditions. A number of clay tablets from Ugarit, dating from the late 13th century BCE, throw new light, Corporal and Damore argue, on the background of the first chapters of Genesis and the myth of Adam. In these tablets, El, the creator deity, and his wife Asherah lived in a vineyard or garden on the slopes of Mount Ararat. So this is an ancient Canaanite tradition where we were just looking, Mount Ararat, somewhere on the slopes of Mount Ararat. So this is according to Wikipedia, that's Mount Ararat. So on these slopes somewhere in a vineyard, the gods El and Asherah, okay, are hanging out on a mountain where Noah's Ark came to rest. The first sinner was not a human being, but an evil god called Horon who wanted to depose El. Horon was thrown down from the mountain of the gods, and in revenge, he transformed the tree of life in the garden into a tree of death and enveloped the whole world in a poisonous fog. Adam was sent down to restore life on earth, but failed because Horon, in the form of a huge serpent, bit him. As a result, Adam and his wife lost their immortality. This myth has found its way into the Bible and the Apocrypha and the pseudepigraphical literature, though it was often transformed or treated critically. Adam, Eve, and the Devil traces the reception of the myth in its many forms and also presents the oldest pictures of Adam and Eve ever identified. One of them is on the front cover of the book. So, back to me. Front cover of the book. Again, just giving you credit here. Thank you so much, Victor, for the super chat and the rabbit trail there. I will get back to the video. Appreciate the love and support, man. Really, really, really do. Let's see. Let's get back to the movie.
Her commands were absolute. No one opposed them. 11 indeed. On this wise she created.
Her husband Kingu she promoted to the highest position, giving him the famous Tablet of Destinies. She proclaimed,
I cast your spell. I make you the greatest in the assembly of the gods. Kingship of all the gods I put in your power. You are the greatest in the assembly of the gods. Kingship of all the gods I put in your power.
The great god Anshar called upon Ea to go fight Tiamat, but his response was shocking.
Ea went to seek out Tiamat's stratagem. He stopped, horror-stricken, then turned back. He came before Anshar the sovereign. He beseeched him with entreaties, saying, My father, Tiamat has carried her actions beyond me. I sought out her course, but my spell cannot counter it. Her strength is enormous. She is utterly terrifying. She is reinforced with a host. None can go out against her. Her challenge was not reduced. It was so loud against me, I became afraid at her clamor. I turned back. My father, do not despair. Send another to her.
Anshar then went to Anu, another senior god, who gave the same response. It was only then that Marduk volunteered to take Tiamat down. Marduk then charges to battle, defeats Kingu simply by approaching, and ultimately kills the sea goddess, creating the world from her carcass. There are several possible points of contact between these two myths.
Real quick, just this doesn't prove atheism. Nobody said it did. So I don't know where you got that from.
Let's begin with the very first line of the book of Genesis. Along with John 3:16, many of us can probably at least start Genesis 1:1.
In the beginning, God created.
This familiar English translation has led to some interpreters suggesting that the first sentence in the Bible is of existential proof.
In the beginning was God.
However, the intended meaning of this first clause is not quite so simply construed as King James had commissioned. The Hebrew phrase that starts off the verse can be translated at least 2, if not 3 different ways, and the translation is significant for reading the rest of the story. Professor David M. Carr notes of this passage.
I know this guy.
One of the first and most important interpretive and translation issues in this chapter is the question of whether Genesis 1:1 is a dependent clause introducing what follows, when God created, or an independent clause, in the beginning, God created.
While there are other interpretive issues involved here, like should this be considered creation from nothing?
Oh, snap. Wade Rogers in the house with another super chat. Thanks, Wade, for showing up today, man. Appreciate the love and support and being a member of the channel. Bless you, my friend. You're the man. Must just be coincidence that Utnapishtim, circa 2100, 1800 BCE, released a dove, a swallow, then a raven after flood? Nothing to be seen here. Isn't it wild? I mean, honestly, someone saying that's pure coincidence or something. Gosh. That's what it seems like Wes Huff acted like in the opening. If you missed it at the beginning, Wade, I showed Wes Huff making a video trying to dismiss. Now, he uses plagiarism, which is why I titled this video very like stolen, which I don't mean literally stolen because these stories weren't copyrighted then, okay? But they definitely borrowed from these stories, right? These traditions. He wants to dismiss dependence completely. Like, he doesn't want Genesis to borrow. what do you do with all that? You just dismiss it. That's pretty much what the apologists have done at this point. And it's unfortunate they don't take serious the actual academic work. And they're setting a tone for Wes is popular now, right? So hundreds of thousands, millions of people who watch the videos are going to get like, they're not ever going to ascertain this work until they come across actual critical scholars who are going to do that kind of careful work. Unfortunate. Unfortunate. Sucks. Wade, you're the man. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to continue the video. And here we go.
Our only concern on this point is Genesis 1:1's potential similarity to Enuma Elish. This story opens.
When the heavens above did not exist, and earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter, and demiurge Tiamat, who gave birth to them all.
Notice how the first line is part of a dependent clause. That is a clause that cannot stand alone in the sentence and is dependent on another clause. This is otherwise known as a temporal clause, describing a period before creation. If Genesis 1:1 should be translated,
when God began to create,
or something similar, then this should describe a situation before God began to create. The arguments are somewhat complex, and we need not go into them here. For example, Professor Robert D. Homestead wrote an article in 2008 dedicated entirely to the grammatical and syntactical features of this first phrase in Genesis 1:1 to determine whether the verse should be translated as a dependent or independent clause. Basically, there are several occurrences of this phrase in the Hebrew Bible, and they are usually translated with the word of attached to them. In the beginning of the reign of so-and-so king. This would mean that Genesis 1:1 would be translated something like,
in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth,
or more smoothly,
when God began to create the heavens and the earth.
When we continue the passage in Genesis 1, if understood in this way, the text is explaining,
when God began to create the heavens and the earth was...
In other words, this was the state of the world when God began to create. When we compare this to other Mesopotamian creation stories, and Enuma Elish in particular, we see something similar. Professor Joseph Blenkinsopp writes,
Genesis 1 belongs to the genre of cosmogony, narratives about world origins, and ancient cosmogonic myths in that culture area begin by describing the way it was at the time of the first creation, only then proceeding to the creation itself.
This is not only true of other ancient Near Eastern cosmogonic myths, but also in at least one other place in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis 2. The second creation story begins by describing the state of the earth before God begins his creative act. Carr writes,
the creation account that follows Genesis 1 in the Bible and likely predated it, Genesis 2:5 to 3:24, likewise begins with a description of the uncreated prologue to God's creation. Genesis 1 similarly begins with a statement of what creation was like before God created.
It seems as though this narrative pattern of describing the pre-creation state of affairs is common not only to ancient Near Eastern compositions, but also to the Old Testament. It appears that Genesis 1 is also following this pattern, perhaps modeled after the opening line of Enuma Elish. This possibility is strengthened by the presence of the Hebrew word tehom, the deep, that is found in Genesis 1:2. Professor Ludwig Kohler and Walter Baumgartner explained that the word Tehom likely is derived from the general Semitic Tiham, sea. So as such, it is not a loanword from Akkadian. Both Akkadian, the language of the Enuma Elish, and Hebrew, the language of the Old Testament, are Semitic languages. And the word Tehom, Hebrew, and Tiamat, the name of the Akkadian sea goddess in Enuma Elish, go back to the Semitic word Teham. In other words, this appears to be a case in which both the Hebrew and Akkadian are drawing on a similar source, but one may not be directly drawing from the other. This is an important point as we want to be precise when attempting to see connections and dependence between texts. As we noted in a previous section, one of the ways that we determine borrowing is the presence of shared language between the two texts. The more unique the language that is shared, the greater the possibility of borrowing. In this instance, one might be tempted to see a direct borrowing of Tiamat.
I see all those
the
ones.
Akkadian sea goddess.
Love y'all.
In
Appreciate
the word
it.
Tehom. But this is not necessarily the case. Both words are clearly cognates, but we may not be able to say more than that from a strictly lexical standpoint. Blenkinsop agrees.
The Tehom may be related to the same Semitic root as the proto-goddess Tiamat, representing the chaotic salt waters of the ocean from whose body the earth was formed.
What is noteworthy, however, is its place in the text. To reiterate, the opening lines in Enuma Elish are,
When the heavens above did not exist, and earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter, and demiurge Tiamat, who gave birth to them all.
Notice that following dependent temporal clauses, we see the figure Tiamat appearing in the first few lines right at the beginning of the text. In Genesis 1, we read,
When God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the deep. Tehom.
As in Enuma Elish, the cognate word for sea shows up in the opening lines following a dependent temporal clause. There
Oh,
is more
snap.
to suggest.
Oh, snap. Oh, snap. The anti-contrarian in the house again with a 10 bomb. Thank you so much for that $10. Appreciate that. The etymological transition from Zeud Sudra, Utnapishtim, to Noah is interesting. The former's meaning long eternal life, and Noah meaning to rest, Yahweh the only eternal in the later Old Testament? Huh. So you're saying that Zeud Sudra and Utnapishtim means long eternal life, and Noah meaning to rest. I want to make sure I got this correct. I'm going to make sure I'm understanding your question properly. Bear with me 1 second here, because I do not know the languages here. Let me try to give you the benefit of the doubt and try to understand exactly what you're asking me. What is this question trying to ask? I don't want to leave you hanging, man. You just hooked me up. So it's saying the person is noticing an interesting shift in meaning between the names of the ancient Mesopotamian flood heroes and the biblical flood hero Noah. They're asking, Mesopotamian flood hero Zeud Sudra Utnapishtim have names meaning long life or eternal life or he found life. Noah in Hebrew means rest or comfort. They wonder if this shift is intentional, and specifically, is the Bible deliberately removing the idea of eternal life from the human flood hero so that only Yahweh is eternal in later Israelite theology? In other words, did the Hebrews downgrade the flood hero's name to avoid giving him divine or eternal associations because in Israelite theology, only Yahweh possesses eternal life? That's a fascinating question, and I'm actually glad you asked that question, because I actually was asking this of I was talking to a scholar before the live stream, and I can't remember which scholar it was, but I was actually mentioning that really strange observation that if you take the earlier stories, Utnapishtim gets immortality and lives forever. So why doesn't the flood hero of the Bible also get separated from humanity and lives forever? We also don't get a genealogy from Utnapishtim. So it's almost like the gods, once they destroy all life on Earth in those older stories, it seems like they're either plot holes or the holes get filled in. I'm going to come to me full screen. So either there are plot holes in the story, which is common in myths, that there are plenty of holes. Like, you mean God didn't know that the serpent was in the garden when Eve? You know, these kinds of plot holes that you kind of like, huh? We still talk about them today. Christians debate them and all that. Plot holes or intentional, and we are missing something. So is there a narration somewhere in the tradition that Utnapishtim had descendants, but Utnapishtim got immortality and those descendants carried on to be the rest of humanity? Or did the gods have to start over once they destroyed all animals and humans? Did they then pinch more clay and create humans again? Is that how the story goes? Because in the biblical account, Noah becomes the progenitor of all life on earth, all humans on earth. And so he's not immortal, he dies. Did they shift the immortality to Enoch and then give him I mean, what do we do with this? Because Enoch acts like Adapa in a way. There's some overlap between the character Enoch, it looks like, and the Adapa character. For those who don't know, Adapa was an ancient sage who was a follower of Ea, Enki, and he gets tipped over in the it's called the wing of the south wind broke or something. I can't remember the name of the actual story, but Adapa gets tipped over in his boat. He starts drowning and he's pissed off, so he breaks the south wind's wing. So there's no wind coming from the south. And Anu in the high heavens is like, whoa, hold on. Who did this? Bring them, summon them to me. And then he ends up, before he goes, Ea and Enki says, don't eat the food, don't drink the water of death and the food of death. They're trying to poison you. But if they give you oil and they want to anoint you, let them anoint you, but don't eat or drink the food. Okay. He goes up there. He doesn't do it. And Anu's like, what have you done, Enki or Ea, depending on the source? So he gets to come back to humanity. But if he would have been granted immortality, he would have had to been taken. Like it seems Enoch was. And Enoch ends up a descendant in that flood myth with Noah. So the question I have is it what you're saying? Or did they just shift the immortality to someone of a descendant that is Enoch and let Enoch get it? And what's going on? This is a good question. Is that difference intentional to say none of the humans have immortality, but Enoch does get taken and walks with God clearly away from humanity? So he does get immortality, I would imagine. It doesn't say that, but he's walked with God 365 days, solar mythology, if you will, solar calendar. But then he's taken. So he's now with gods. He's with the gods. He's with the council of the gods. I don't know the answer. It's interesting. These are great questions. You have some really good super chats. And then they really make me head scratch and go, huh, why does Noah die, but the other earlier flood myth heroes get to live forever, but they also get separated from humanity? So there is a change, clearly. There's differences, but why? Are you onto something? Probably. I know your question, no matter what, is onto something. It's the answer that I'm curious about. That I'm in the same boat as you, anti-contrarian. I really enjoy these super chats. Thank you so much for the question. I really appreciate that. Adapa and the fruit of life, right? Yeah. I mean, this is such a good question. I think it is. The Bible is hash shroom medical text, yet Derek never mentions anything about medical knowledge in the Bible. It's because he doesn't know where it is at, apparently. I'd show him if he wanted me to. I think, aren't you the guy who constantly comes in here, Jesus is a mushroom, everything's a mushroom experience kind of thing? I don't know. It seems like there's always a hidden secret, drug thing going on in a lot of people's minds. Wing of Shoe, thank you so much. Don't get me wrong, there was plenty of that in the ancient world, but You have to have a secret decoder ring. And by the way, Kevin, just so you know, I would love to see you in a room debate against astrotheology people who are so convinced the whole Bible is astrotheology, and just watch you guys go back and forth about you think it's all drugs and they think it's all astrotheology, and just like everything goes in terms of interpretation. Because what method are you using to be so confident on the meaning and certainty of what these specific words mean and their proper interpretation? That's the difficult part about these things. I think it's important that, we do. Wing of Shu, thank you so much. Gilgamesh, in an ironic way, gives up immortality. I don't think he meant to. I think that's how the story plays out. According to the story, he tries to get it, right? And the funniest part to me is when he's there with Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is going to tell him the story of how he gets immortality, because he's like, give me immortality. I came this far. And finally, there's a test that is posed to Gilgamesh by Utnapishtim. And he says, all right, stay awake for 7 days. And if you stay awake for 7 days, I don't know if he says he's going to grant him immortality or whatnot. In fact, I've got the translation of this here. I'm going to do seven loaves. Let's do loaves. I'm going to do loaves. Instead of 7 days, I'm going to just do loaves. Okay. All right. In the morning, we will let loaves of bread shower down. I'm getting Gilgamesh here. I'll show you guys in just a moment. In the morning, I will wet loaves. That's Shamash talking. Inside the boat, seal the entry. That's okay. She baked his loaves and placed them by his head. Okay, here we are. So this is where I think the test for him not passing and getting immortality comes from. So he's talking about, now the deliberation should be about him. Inla went up inside the boat and grasping my hand made me go up. He had my wife go up and kneel by my side. He touched our forehead, and this is how he's receiving immortality or a blessing from the gods, right? Standing between us, he blessed us. Previously, Utnapishtim was a human being, but now let Utnapishtim and his wife become like us, the gods. And that become like the gods stuff is what we hear with Adam and Eve. I think that's interesting as well. So there's language that sounds similar, which is something that kind of got not mentioned about Gilgamesh when it came to Wes Huff's review about this earlier. Let Utnapishtim reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. Again, there's 4 mouths of the rivers, and you also get the mouths of the rivers in Genesis. They took us far away and settled us at the mouth of the rivers. Now then, who will convene the gods on your behalf? Now that you may find the life that you are seeking. Wait, you must not lie down for 6 days. So this is talking to Gilgamesh now. You must not lie down for 6 days and 7 nights. Soon as he sat down with his head between his legs, sleep like a fog blew upon him. So this is talking about Gilgamesh. Utnapishtim said to his wife, look there, the man, the youth, who wanted eternal life, sleep like a fog blew over him. His wife said to Utnapishtim, the faraway, touch him, let the man awaken. Let him return safely by the way he came. Let him return to his land by the gate through which he left. Utnapishtim said to his wife, mankind is deceptive and will deceive you. Well, that might hint at the whole hearts are desperately wicked stuff. I don't know. I mean, if we're granting Gilgamesh as an anti-text to the Genesis narrative of Noah's flood, and he just got done talking about the flood, mankind is deceptive and will deceive you? Well, shit, that sounds like Genesis 6. So come, bake loaves for him and keep setting them by his head and draw on the wall each day that he lay down. She baked his loaves and placed them by his head and marked on the wall the day that he lay down. The first loaf was desiccated, the second stale, the third moist, the fourth turned white. The fifth sprouted gray mold, and the sixth is still fresh. The seventh, suddenly he touched him, and the man woke. Gilgamesh said to Utnapishtim, the very moment sleep was pouring over me, you touched me and alerted me, meaning he didn't actually sleep for long, right? Like, oh, I didn't really go to sleep, that kind of thing. The very moment, right? Utnapishtim spoke to Gilgamesh saying, look over here, Gilgamesh, count your loaves. You should be aware of what is marked on the wall. Your first loaf is desiccated, the second stale, the third moist, your fourth turned to white. It's the 5th sprouted gray mold. The 6th is still fresh. The 7th, suddenly he touched him, and the man awoke. Gilgamesh said to Utnapishtim, the very moment sleep was pouring over me, you touched me and alerted me. Utnapishtim spoke to Gilgamesh, saying, look over here, Gilgamesh, count the loaves. You should be aware of what is marked on the wall. Your first loaf. Okay, he repeats it. I don't know why it's repeating it again. Maybe the text has that. I don't know. Oh, woe, what shall I do, Utnapishtim? Where shall I go? The snatcher has taken hold of my flesh. In my bedroom, death dwells, and wherever I set my foot, there too is death. Home empty-handed, Utnapishtim said to Urshanabi, the ferryman, may the harbor reject you, may the ferry landing reject you, may you, who used to walk at shores, be denied at shores, the man in front of whom you walk, matted his hair, chains his body. Animal skins have ruined his beautiful skin. Take him away, Urshanabi, bring him to the washing place. Let him wash his matted hair in water like Elu. Let him cast away his animal skin and have the sea carry it off. Let his body be moistened with fine oil. Let the wrap around his head be made new. Let him wear royal robes worthy of him until he goes off to his city, until he sets off on his way. Let his royal robes not become spotted. Let it be perfectly new. Urshanabi took him away and brought him to the washing place. He washed it. Anyway, he goes on to tell him about a plant, and then eventually goes to get the plant, old man made young kind of plant. I'm just scrolling down here. And here it is. So the plant name is Old Man Becomes a Young Man. Then I will eat it and return to the condition of my youth. This idea of renewal. And of course, the snake ends up taking it from Gilgamesh. But I don't know what the cause of his immortality being taken away. I just figure I would highlight the text shows he's trying to show that he deserves it or something. I don't know what to make of that. In fact, let me ask, since you super chatted me and I don't want to leave you hanging here, let me ask and just see if there's anything that ChatGPT can help me with here. Why doesn't Gilgamesh get immortality in the epic? Is it he couldn't stay awake? Is it something else? Let's just see what it says. Great question, Derek. The real answer is deeper, more symbolic than the he couldn't stay awake moment. That scene is important, but it isn't the reason Gilgamesh fails. So why Gilgamesh does not get immortality, the staying awake test is symbolic, not the actual reason. When Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh, stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, it's not an earn immortality challenge. It's a demonstration that Gilgamesh is still immortal. Mortals sleep, mortals decay, mortals cannot sustain divine vigilance. Utnapishtim is proving a point. Look, you can't even conquer sleep. How can you conquer death? So the failed sleep test does not deny Gilgamesh immortality. It reveals why immortality was never an option for him. Gilgamesh was never eligible for immortality in the first place. Unlike Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, but still fundamentally mortal. In Mesopotamian thought, the gods fixed the boundaries of life and death for humanity. Immortality is not a reward for courage or heroism. It's a cosmic privilege granted in extremely rare mythic circumstances, usually because of a major world reset like the flood. Utnapishtim only became immortal because the gods needed a new beginning for humanity. They say explicitly, we shall make Utnapishtim and his wife like us gods. This is one-time cosmic exception, not a general possibility. So Gilgamesh fails not because he didn't pass a test, but because immortality was never available to him. And it gives all these different things. So here's the soundbite. It says, Gilgamesh doesn't fail to get immortality because he couldn't stay awake. The test just proves he's human. In Mesopotamian thought, and we already read that. Okay, we get the point. All right, well, dang, that's interesting. Learned something about this epic that I think makes sense, but sleep also symbolizes death. So this is the other thing that goes deeper than what ChatGPT even responded with, is that oftentimes sleep symbolizes death. That's why they're mortal. And that's why you get later legends from Honi the circle drawer. I cover this in other stories. Epimenides in the Greek legends Honi the circle drawer, he sleeps for 70 years, Epimenides for 56 years. There are legends of the sleepers of Ephesus, the 7 sleepers in the cave, and Christian legend or hagiography, they call it. And then you get the legend in the Quran with the sleepers of the cave. In Surah 18, the Al-Kahf story about the dog guarding the cave of the sleepers, and that symbolizes death. Of course, those stories have resurrection themes, but yeah, sleep is a symbol of death, and that's a trope throughout Gilgamesh. And then Genesis is all about immortality, or humans who could potentially have immortality losing it. And I don't see why that isn't a powerful point to address. Again, if you ever watch this back and you didn't watch the beginning of this, I played a review of Wes Huff's video, and this entire title of this video is Noah's Flood was stolen from Mesopotamia. I put still in scare quotes to point out that's the dirty word I'm using to get you to click the video to see it's not stolen as much as it's clearly borrowed. It's not like it has a moral value of, oh, you're not allowed to do that. But notice that is the problem for apologists, not for us. We don't see it as an ethical wrongdoing that the Bible's borrowing myth and legend. But if you take the Bible as sacred and above all, and you don't want to allow it to borrow from the earlier legends and myths, then yeah, you see this as stolen or plagiarized, and you want to act like it's not borrowing from those sacred traditions of other cultures that aren't from your Bible. But they don't count those as sacred. They're pagan. They're no-nos. They're bad. And Genesis seems to reflect that idea. It's contrary to the older traditions. Really, really appreciate that super chat. Thank you so much for everything. Let me see. Did I miss anyone else? I don't want to miss anybody. I don't think so. Let me double check here. Okay. What the heck? I was trying to see the goal because it said we had 15 super chats, and I usually do 15 as the goal within the time frame. We didn't hit that time frame. Dang it. Okay, it's all good. I'm trying to set goals and see how they pan out. All right. Look, I will link the video. We've gone on for 3 hours and 20 minutes, and I think it's important that that's true. That's true. This is a good comment. Call the way. Gilgamesh did become immortal. It's his story that lives on. Yes, that's his form of immortality, clearly. But it's not the expectation. You see what I'm saying? So, yes, I think you're right on that. And the story ends the way it begins. Joshua Bowen told me that telling of Gilgamesh's story is his immortality. It starts with him measuring Uruk and the size of the city he built, and it ends with him back in Uruk measuring the city that he built and the size and all of that and its beauty and glory and all that. And the telling of the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh is Gilgamesh's immortality. That's pretty much what you're seeing. It's telling is circular, so you have to keep telling it like a loop, which is immortal. But then also just telling the story is his own immortality, his fame being told over and over. Let me put this video here so that if anybody was curious to watch the video that we were watching and that I didn't finish, we were only 18 minutes into an hour and 10-minute video. Joshua Bowen wrote the script. This is the video here in case anybody is interested. I put the link in the chat, and we were just watching. We're at 18 minutes, 23 seconds. If you want to pick up where we left off or watch it from the beginning, it doesn't matter to me. The true origins of Genesis creation will blow your mind in the beginning. That's the thumbnail with the orange horned deity with the earth behind him. And then, of course, the Gilgamesh tablet behind in the beginning. So there you have that. I really appreciate everyone hanging out with me on a Saturday. We're just having fun. And Genesis is indebted, no doubt, to these traditions. Anyone denying that, I think, is just not aware of the latest, greatest contemporary academic positions. That is not to say that we have everything figured out in terms of all the details in those, or how do we for sure. How do we know exactly what source, let's say, the Adam and Eve myth is borrowing from and all its details? That's up for grabs. There's always different scholars with different takes of what earlier Mesopotamia material or Canaanite material seems to be paralleled. Then I've got scholars who are coming on that are cutting edge in different ways that know about Greek material, and they think some of the material we find in Genesis has parallels to Greek sources. And I'll let them do the talking. I'll let you see. Stay tuned. If you haven't subscribed to Myth Vision, this is the YouTube channel where you're going to find stuff you've never heard in your Sunday school. I can guarantee you that. You will probably never hear in seminaries, in many seminaries. If you do, it's probably in a passing remark. There's material we cover that some PhDs who join the channel are like, oh, I didn't know that about that other scholar. We have a buffet of critical scholarship that we bring to you, and you get to choose what you want to eat and what you don't as a viewer. And I love doing this stuff. So seriously, love everybody. I'm going to go get some food in me. It's been 3 hours, 20 minutes, been rambling on. We could continue watching this. I've got other videos I want to cover with you in the future. I think we can even respond and watch some of my older documentaries that I've done, which get into the weeds, like the one where I covered this book. I find it fascinating, I tell you. And I emailed this scholar, by the way, to see about doing an interview. One of the academics who wrote this book died, and the other one is still alive. And I'm hoping that I can get that person to come join me for the show to talk about this Canaanite pre-Adam and Eve story, where the character in the story's name is Adamu. This Canaanite story, Adamu. Even the name correlates to the character we find in the Bible, right? What did we do? We just did a bunch of heresy, huh? Carl Ruck said publicly that John M. Allegro was right about mushrooms in early Christianity, yet Derek thinks he knows more than Carl and John Allegro because Derek says there might not be shrooms in the text. Kevin, come on, man. Really? I have I'll put it this way. There's a lot of scholars I know who just think John M. Allegro was mistaken. Okay, he was wrong about things. And these are scholars who read the same text, who've read the Dead Sea Scrolls, who've read the New Testament in Greek. They know the Hebrew. They know the Aramaic. They've read it. They say, hey, look, he's wrong about this. Carl Jung may be right. There may be some stuff there. I don't know that Carl Ruck, follows everything that John M. Allegro says. I don't think he does. I'd be shocked. But again, Carl Ruck's like 96 years old now. And I could give him a call and talk to him since I have his cell phone number and say, hey, Carl, just curious to know your thoughts on this. I'm sure he thinks there's some things in some places, but like, Kevin, you pop in the chat almost every time I turn around, bro, obsessed with one and one only thing, and that is mushrooms or secret drugs hidden in the Bible somewhere. And it's cool, but it's like the only thing you think about, shrooms in the text. And it's like, bro, I mean, like I'd need to see really, really clear evidence. Sure, manna, you can interpret the manna as potential shrooms that come up out of the ground. Or you might want to say the tree, the fruit of the tree that was in Genesis. I've heard that interpretation. That was the Amanita muscaria mushroom that grew underneath the pine tree in Genesis. I've read that. I mean, I've read it different accounts. And I'm just like, yeah, it seems speculative. Could it be true? Possibly. I'm just not persuaded it is, and I'm not an expert, and I don't know if you are. Maybe you know how to read these ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, cuneiform materials and Greek and Latin and all that. Maybe you know. I don't know. But if you're relying on only Carl Ruck for his opinion, or some other guy maybe on YouTube who likes to get into drugs in the ancient world, I'd just be careful. You know what I'm saying? I would just be careful. You know what I'm saying? Kevin's arguing with me. Carl Ruck knows all about mushrooms and cannabis in the Bible, yet Derek acts like it's not true, which is absolute madness. Derek should probably look in brain transplants. Kevin, you're hilarious. No comment, man. No comment. I'm not interested in playing games. Look, I appreciate everybody. Moses was getting high off fumes of the burning bush. Yeah, but they have to be mushrooms. They can't possibly be fumes from the earth like the Oracle of Delphi. Couldn't be that. It has to be a mushroom or cannabis. You heard him. Kevin said so. I don't know. I'd have to call Carl Ruck and actually ask him, hey, man, what's your thoughts on this? I imagine there's probably some hint somewhere, but I don't think it is like a primary, like a huge issue throughout the Bible like that. A lot of people make brain transplant, right? Is Snoop Dogg in the Bible? Now that seems persuasive to me. That seems persuasive. Anyway, I really got to go get some food in me. I'll give Carl Ruck a call. We'll find out how shroomy the Bible is. Maybe it's made of shrooms. For all I know, they might be printing out the Bible on shrooms, and I'm reading from shroom paper. I don't know. I don't know, man. I don't know. All right, y'all. If you need anything, email me. You know my email, mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com or derek@mythvisionpodcast.com. We have courses you can go sign up for PhDs that we have. I hope you enjoyed the show. Like this video before you leave, please. Comment your thoughts after the stream is over. Share it with a friend. And yeah, anytime we do live streams, join the membership program. We see the symbols next to your name and super chat. It helps us keep the lights on. I really, really do appreciate it, everybody. Have a wonderful day. See ya.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.